Beneath Oregon's quiet deserts and forested peaks lies a buried world older than Clovis, stranger than legend, and still rewriting everything we thought we knew about human history. Rock art no one can decode. Bones no one can explain. Floods that carried mountains, and footprints that shouldn't exist. This isn't folklore. It's science. Losing sleep. Welcome to 2 hours of unexplained mysteries about pre-flood Oregon, where the rocks remember more than we do, and the deeper you dig, the weirder it gets. Before we dive headfirst into Oregon's ancient enigmas, take a second to subscribe, because around here, the mysteries never clock out. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now as you're listening to this? Let's see how far and wide the weirdness travels. Rimrock Draw rock shelters is greater than 18,000-year signal. It begins in the kind of place that doesn't want to be found. High desert, dry air, volcanic dust for miles. The kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something. Rimrock Draw rock shelter sits tucked beneath a basalt rim, half collapsed and half forgotten, barely noticeable until you're standing in it. And even then, it doesn't speak in full sentences. It mumbles in stone and ash and the occasional tooth. But what it may have said, if we're reading it right, is this: someone was here. More than 18,000 years ago. That would be before Clovis, before mammoths had finished their exit, before the textbooks get comfortable. But let's rewind. Back to 2009, when archaeologists started excavating Rimrock Draw in earnest. They weren't expecting headlines. The site was modest, a shallow shelter, the kind used intermittently by travelers, not settlers, seasonal rest stops, not destinations. What they found early on matched that assumption. Lithic flakes, some fire-cracked rock, maybe 9,000 years old. Business as usual. Then came the camel. More specifically, a tooth fragment from an extinct Pleistocene camelid, buried deep beneath younger cultural layers. Alongside it, a bison tooth, and above them, a layer of volcanic ash. That was the real punchline. The ash was unmistakably from the eruption of Mount St. Helens, known as Set S ash, which erupted roughly 15,600 years ago. So if the tools and teeth were beneath that layer, the implication was unavoidable. People were here earlier, potentially much earlier. Radiocarbon dates from the tooth enamel suggested an age of around 18,250 years. That's not just pre-Clovis, that's pre-everything, in the standard American migration timeline. Most migration models pin the earliest viable human entry into the Americas around 16,000 years ago, post-glacial retreat, through a narrow corridor or along a kelp highway skimming the Pacific coast. But this would mean people had already made it inland, into Oregon's desert interior, before the glaciers had even fully blinked. That's the sort of statement that makes archaeologists flinch. Not because it's impossible, but because it demands rearranging the furniture of everything else. Still, the critics circled like ravens. Was it really a human occupation layer? Could the tools have moved? Were the stratigraphic layers as clear-cut as they seemed? The excavation team was careful, meticulous, and very, very patient. They found obsidian flakes, not just natural shards, but flakes struck off with intent. The kind of intent that only people have. They tested them for use-wear patterns. One flake bore traces of animal tissue, suggesting it had been used to process meat. Another had hints of plant residue. These were not rocks that happened to look human. These were tools. Or, at least, they had every reason to be. But archaeology is not about certainty. It's about probability, patterns, and endurance, emotional and geological. The doubts never fully disappear. Could the camel tooth have sunk through older sediments, disturbed by rodents or freeze-thaw cycles? Could the obsidian have been displaced by roots, erosion, or the slow violence of time? The team responded with more dating, more sediment analysis, more careful mapping of every single artifact, and yet, the questions remain. Because to accept the full implications of Rimrock Draw means admitting that people didn't just sprint across Beringia and zip down the coast. They wandered, lingered, explored. That they were here, not by accident or necessity, but because they had already begun the long habit of being human, showing up in unlikely places, at unlikely times, for reasons no one will ever fully explain. If the site holds up, if subsequent seasons keep confirming the is greater than 18,000 year signal, it forces us to revisit the myths we've built around firsts. The first Americans, the first tools, the first fires. Rimrock Draw suggests that we might have been centuries or even millennia late to the party, and that the party may not have started where we thought. But if they were here, really here, then who were they? Where did they go? And what else did they leave behind? Which brings us to another lingering anomaly in the high desert caves of Oregon. A mystery not buried in ash, but braided in sagebrush, twisted by hand, and older than nearly every pair of shoes in human history. Western-stemmed tradition versus Clovis. The story of first arrivals in the Americas often plays like a Western. One dominant character, plenty of swagger, and just enough evidence to keep things dramatic. That character, for decades, has been Clovis. The fluted spear, point clean, symmetrical, deadly, has become shorthand for the first Americans. They showed up around 13,000 years ago, the story goes, with their beautifully crafted stone points and a taste for megafauna. Case closed. Except, of course, it's not. Because long before the Clovis point strutted onto the stage, something older, and in some ways, subtler, was already in the wings. It's called the Western-stemmed tradition. And if you want to watch archaeologists quietly unravel in a hotel conference room, just ask whether WST is older than Clovis, independent of Clovis, or somehow evolved parallel to Clovis. Then sit back and enjoy the chaos. In Oregon, the debate is less theoretical and more stratigraphic, literally. Because inside the deep, dry layers of Paisley Caves and other rock shelters scattered through the Fort Rock Basin, archaeologists have unearthed stemmed projectile points that predate, or at least rival, the age of Clovis. Some are found in contexts securely dated to over 13,000 years ago, sometimes as early as 14,000. Which is awkward, because the defining feature of Clovis, the fluted base, a channel knocked out to aid hafting onto spear shafts, is entirely absent. Instead, WST points are stemmed, narrower at the base, often with shoulders or barbs, but no flute. Technologically, they're a different beast. Functionally, they did the same job. But culturally, that's where things get murky. Clovis was supposed to be the Big Bang, a sudden, rapid dispersal of an advanced lithic technology across the continent. Its sharp-edged presence is found from Montana to Mexico. It's clean, consistent, and until recently, comfortably first. But the Western stem tradition throws a wrench into that story, because it suggests another group, or perhaps several, were already established in the American West, crafting their own points with their own rules. Not just earlier, but elsewhere. And not just once, but continuously, for thousands of years. Were these traditions related? Did one evolve from the other? Was there a brief moment of contact, some ancient version of a prehistoric tech swap, or did they exist in total isolation from one another? The caves don't answer. They just pile up questions in layers of silt and bat guano. Some archaeologists argue that WST and Clovis may have emerged from a common ancestor, a broader techno-complex somewhere in Northeast Asia or Beringia that splintered as humans spread southward. Others think they're entirely independent, separate arrivals, separate routes, separate timelines. One maritime, hugging the Pacific coast, the other interior, surging through the ice-free corridor. Then there's the third option, convergence. That human brains, placed in similar landscapes, with similar problems to solve, namely, how to kill things with rocks, came up with parallel solutions. In that view, The similarities between point types aren't evidence of cultural connection, but of behavioral inevitability. All of it is plausible. None of it is proven. And so the debates continue, like dueling monologues. The WST side pointing to Paisley Caves and Connley Caves to secure radiocarbon dates and deeper than Clovis contexts. The Clovis traditionalists countering with concerns about stratigraphic mixing, bioturbation, and those pesky contamination risks that haunt every pre-Clovis claim like geological ghosts. It doesn't help that stone tools don't come with user manuals. You can't carbon date obsidian directly. You can only date what's around it. The dung, the charcoal, the bone fragments. And you hope none of it moved. You pray the pack rats stayed out of it. But even with those caveats, the evidence is stubborn. WST tools are consistently found in early layers, often in association with ancient human DNA, even coprolites fossilized feces that clearly belonged to someone who wasn't just passing through. Someone who lived here, ate here, stayed a while. And if they did, then Clovis isn't the main act. It's a remix, a loud, flashy sequel to a quieter, older story playing out in the high desert. The real question, though, isn't just who came first. It's why these traditions stayed separate. Why didn't they blend? Why didn't the stemmed and the fluted mix like everything else in human history eventually does? Maybe they did, and we haven't found the evidence. Or maybe the boundaries were cultural different identities, different beliefs, different languages. Maybe fluted points were fashionable in one valley and deeply unfashionable in another. Or maybe they told stories about each other, stories we'll never hear, about strangers with weird points and different ways of lighting a fire, ghosts in the next canyon over. And yet, for all their differences, both traditions have one thing in common. They vanished. Their toolkits, their rituals, their migrations, all eventually swept into silence. Except for one thing they left behind, not in obsidian or bone, but in something even more fragile, woven sagebrush bark. Footwear, of all things, stitched together by hand, delicate and purposeful. Which raises a new question. What kind of people leave sandals in a cave 10,000 years before leather boots become common? And who were they walking toward? If your brain's already doing somersaults 2 mysteries in, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. We're just getting warmed up. And while you're here, let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Always curious to see who's wandering through the deep past with us. Fort Rock, sagebrush bark sandals. They weren't meant to last. Sagebrush bark, stripped into thin fibers, twisted into cordage, and woven into a shape that barely resembles the idea of a sandal more net than shoe, more function than fashion. Fragile, dry, brittle, the kind of thing that disintegrates long before it becomes evidence. And yet, here they are, dozens of them, left behind in a collapsed cave in Oregon's high desert, buried beneath layers of volcanic ash and wind-blown sand, tucked in a place no one was supposed to find. But someone did back in 1938 when archaeologist Luther Cressman pulled a pair of what he called slippers from beneath the floor of Fort Rock Cave. He was expecting a sight, maybe some charcoal, a few flakes of obsidian. Instead, he found a time capsule. The sandals were so well preserved, so dry, so eerily intact, that for a moment, they didn't seem ancient at all. But they were. Radiocarbon dating has placed the oldest examples at over 10,000 years old, some as early as 10,400 years before present. That makes them the oldest known footwear in the world. And they weren't alone. Cressman and later archaeologists recovered over 70 individual sandals, some child-sized, some large and wide, some still stiff with age-hardened fibers. Each one was woven with a level of care that suggests more than mere practicality. This wasn't just foot protection, it was a craft, a practice, a knowledge passed down. And yet, no one knows exactly who made them. There's no associated village, no house pits, no bones arranged neatly in burials nearby. The makers of the Fort Rock sandals left no diary, no carvings, no murals explaining themselves. Just layers of silence, and the impression of motion, people on the move. What's remarkable about the sandals besides the age is how standardized they are. Most are made in a style archaeologists call the Fort Rock type. A flat sole of twined sagebrush bark, with a toe flap that folds up and a heel cord that wraps around the ankle. Not elegant, but effective. You could walk miles in these, and someone clearly did. That raises a quiet but fundamental question. If people had the time and inclination to make dozens of woven bark sandals, what kind of life were they living? This wasn't a desperate group stumbling through the wilderness. This was a community with structure, enough surplus energy to focus on textiles, enough know-how to twist and loop bark into patterns, enough foresight to prepare footwear in bulk. For what? For a seasonal migration? A gathering? A ritual? Or maybe these sandals weren't meant to be worn at all. Some researchers have wondered if they had ceremonial purposes. Were they offerings? Status items? Did they belong to the dead, buried and lost when the cave collapsed? Or were they cached, stored for later, never reclaimed? We'll never know. But the fact that they exist at all shifts our understanding of these people. It moves them out of the abstract beyond just hunters and gatherers with stone tools and no names and into something closer to familiar. These were people with preferences, styles, habits, maybe even complaints about the fit. These were people who looked down at their feet and said, "This'll do." In other words, humans, just like us. And yet, they lived in a landscape that no longer exists. When these sandals were made, the Fort Rock Basin wasn't a dry desert. It was a watery plain, dotted with lakes and wetlands, teeming with birds, fish, and reeds. Seasonal flooding, spring melt, and pluvial lakes shaped the rhythms of movement. People likely traveled from island to island, shelter to shelter, tracking the rise and fall of resources like clockwork. And where there are wetlands, there are reeds. And where there are reeds, there are textiles. The Fort Rock sandals are part of a larger pattern. Early humans in the Great Basin using perishable materials, basketry, cordage, mats, nets, to build a life in a world that demanded adaptability. The problem, of course, is that those materials rarely survive. For every pair of sagebrush sandals found, there are probably thousands that turned to dust centuries ago. Entire toolkits lost to time simply because they weren't made of stone. This skews the archaeological record. It favors the durable, the sharp, the things that kill, not the things that protect or comfort. But the sandals whisper otherwise. They speak of the domestic, the habitual, the quiet persistence of everyday life. They speak of people who moved often, yes, but not aimlessly. They were guided by memory, by knowledge, by pathways and stories long since erased. And as we stare down at these tightly woven relics of an unknowable world, another question presses in. What else lies just beneath the ash and dust hidden in collapsed caves, or lost in dried-up lakes that could reshape everything we think we know about the earliest Oregonians? Perhaps, in the deeper layers of the same cave, there's a darker enigma still unresolved, one that smells of smoke, reads like a riddle in charcoal, and refuses to burn clean. Was someone already there, long before we're ready to admit it? Fort Rock Cave's oldest layers. There's something about charcoal that makes it feel intimate, like a secret burned into silence. The act of fire, of someone crouching near a flickering flame thousands of years ago, leaves behind a black smudge in the earth. A stain, really. Nothing flashy, just carbon and memory. And if you're very, very lucky, a few stray embers might still hold a date. At Fort Rock Cave, the ash didn't speak loudly. It whispered, smoldered in obscurity for decades before anyone paid it proper attention. While the world marveled at the sagebrush bark sandals, that miraculous woven evidence of prehistoric fashion sense, a darker, deeper layer remained. Charcoal fragments buried beneath the feet of ghosts. And here's where the timeline begins to buckle. In the 1,960 seconds, archaeologist Stephen Bedwell conducted deeper excavations into Fort Rock Cave. Unlike Cressman before him, who focused on the upper, sandal-bearing deposits, Bedwell went further literally and interpretively. Below the known levels, he found fire-cracked rock, fragments of bone, and scattered charcoal, all buried under sterile-looking sediments that suggested serious age. And when he sent those charred samples off for radiocarbon dating, the results came back strange. One sample read approximately 13,000 years before present. That would place human activity in Fort Rock Cave at or near the end of the Pleistocene before Clovis, and certainly before the assumed timeline of widespread human occupation in Oregon's interior. It was, for the moment, an outlier. And outliers make people nervous, especially when they rely on charcoal, a substance notorious for playing tricks on archaeologists. Charcoal can move, it can drift down through cracks in sediments. It can be redeposited by water, animals, wind. It can lie, or at least, it can be made to look like it's telling the truth when it isn't. So skeptics pounced. They asked whether Bedwell's deepest layers were truly in situ undisturbed, original contexts, or if they were a jumbled mix of older and younger materials. They questioned the sampling methods, the integrity of the stratigraphy, and because the earliest date came without stone tools or obvious artifacts in direct association, it was easy to wave away. Maybe the charcoal didn't mean anything. Maybe it was just some old branch, burned in a wildfire, caught in a mudslide, and preserved by accident. Or maybe the cave's natural layering had been disturbed over the millennia, and what looked like a pristine occupation surface was just geological noise. But what if it wasn't? What if the charcoal was real, human-made, hearth-born, and truly dated to 13,000 years ago? That would make Fort Rock Cave one of the earliest known habitation sites in the Pacific Northwest. A fire flickering in the darkness of an Ice Age lake basin, long before the timeline admits anyone should have been here. The thing is, that date does match other anomalies in the region. The western-stemmed tradition projectile points from nearby caves, the ancient sandals just above. The repeated hints that Oregon's high desert was not empty but occupied, seasonally, episodically, maybe sparsely, but undeniably, humanly. And if we entertain that possibility, then we have to start imagining what kind of people would be here so early, in a land that looked nothing like today. At the end of the Pleistocene, the Fort Rock Basin was a watery world. Pluvial lakes shimmered in every low spot. The sky was colder, the air wetter. Herds of now extinct animals may have moved through the sagebrush flats. And amid this shifting environment, a small group of humans could have paused inside the cave just long enough to build a fire, eat something, sharpen a few tools, and move on. Not a village, not a civilization. Just a moment, a flicker, preserved by accident. But those are the moments that matter most, because they force us to confront the limits of evidence. We want stories to be clear, layered, linear, lit like a stage play. But the deep past isn't like that. It's full of half-buried signals, ambiguity, doubt. And Fort Rock Cave's oldest layers live precisely in that liminal zone, too vague to celebrate, too compelling to forget. So we're left with charcoal and questions, and the uncomfortable realization that the oldest signal from Fort Rock might still be real, just unprovable, unrepeatable, a scientific loose end. The kind that researchers either chase for decades or quietly pretend never existed. But the ash is still there, sitting in a drawer, filed under inconclusive, whispering something that sounds suspiciously like, "Look deeper." And in the caves just a few miles away where layers run thicker and time gets tangled, someone did, a set of rock shelters where the human past refuses to lay flat and the dating math makes people squint sideways. A place where history bends. Again. Connley Caves Chronology. If Fort Rock Cave was a quiet whisper, then the Connley Caves are more like a muttered argument, overlapping voices, broken timelines, and sediment that doesn't stay where it's told. Located just east of Fort Rock Basin, this cluster of shallow shelters has been excavated, re-excavated, debated, and reinterpreted more than once. And yet, for all the attention, one central question continues to flicker like a bad light bulb. When did people first arrive here, and how long did they stay? At first glance, the Connley Caves don't look like much. Wind-scoured alcoves in an uplifted ridge of volcanic tuff, modest depth, sparse shelter. The kind of place that feels more like a waiting room than a home. But for archaeologists, that's exactly the appeal. The caves sit at the edge of what was once a vast wetland complex, a chain of lakes and marshes that would have attracted birds, fish, game, and, naturally, humans. Initial digs in the 1,960 seconds turned up signs of long-term use: stone tools, burned bone, fire-cracked rock, radiocarbon dates that spanned thousands of years. But it wasn't until more recent excavations beginning in the early 2000 seconds that the deeper layers began to raise deeper questions. Because beneath the familiar Holocene record, beneath the grindstones and corner-notched projectile points, lay older material. And not just old, confusingly old. In some units, radiocarbon dates came back at over 13,000 years before present. In others, even older. But the stratigraphy, the physical layering of sediments, didn't always behave. Some layers appeared compressed, disturbed, or inverted. Artifacts from different eras showed up in close quarters. A kind of chronological vertigo set in. The obvious question was, had the layers been mixed? Were burrowing animals, erosion, or ancient flood events responsible for rearranging the evidence? Or was something else going on, something cultural, something deliberate? One possibility. People returned here, again and again, for thousands of years, sometimes disturbing older layers in the process. Caves like Connley don't preserve time as a neat staircase. They preserve it like a shuffled deck. Each card is still there, but the order can't be trusted without a microscope and a headache. Still, some things are clear. At least 9 of the Connley shelters show repeated signs of human use over the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. And at least one cave, Connley Cave 4, has yielded stone tools consistent with the Western STEM tradition, dated to as early as 13,200 years ago. That's either right at the edge of Clovis or just before it, depending on who you ask and how much caffeine they've had. But the real intrigue comes not just from the early arrival, but the continuity of occupation. Some shelters show signs of use stretching across millennia, from Ice Age hunter-gatherers to Mid-Holocene fishers to more recent foragers living in a rapidly drying landscape. The caves became a kind of echo chamber of human adaptation. As the wetlands outside rose and fell, as climate swung from cold to warm and back again, people kept coming back. Why? Well, that's part of the mystery. The Fort Rock Connley area wasn't always a paradise. It had dry seasons, freezing nights, and dust storms that could strip paint off a pickup. But it also had predictability, lakes that held water longer than the ones further south, bird migrations that followed the same patterns every year, edible plants that returned with the thaw. In a world full of uncertainty, this was a place with a kind of seasonal heartbeat, and it was remembered. Maybe not with maps, but with stories, routes, trails. The caves might have been landmarks in a network of oral geography waypoints in the mental atlas of deep time travel. They weren't permanent homes, but they were never truly abandoned either. That's what makes the Connley Caves so maddening. They hint at something big, a long, unbroken chain of human presence in Oregon's interior, stretching back farther than most textbooks are ready to acknowledge. But they do it in a way that resists closure. The evidence is just fragmented enough, just ambiguous enough, that the story remains open-ended. And maybe that's the point. In the Connley Caves, you don't get a perfect sequence. You get scatter, overlap, a story told in drafts, edits, and erasures. It's a reminder that human history wasn't written in ink, but in dust. That continuity doesn't always mean clarity. Sometimes it means persistence, people showing up, again and again, because they knew something we've forgotten. But if they were here this early, this long, this often, then what were they doing when they weren't inside the caves? What did they carve? What did they leave behind? And what meanings did they inscribe in stone that still refuses to speak? For that, we follow a trail east to a windswept pass, where ancient figures are carved into the rock, horned, silent, weather-worn, waiting. Picture rock pass petroglyphs. They stare back at you. Figures chipped into basalt, some with horns, others with strange torsos or outstretched limbs, frozen mid-movement against the desert stone. They don't blink. They don't explain themselves. They just remain quiet and unsettling in a place few people pass through by accident. Picture rock pass doesn't sound ancient. It sounds like a tourist pullout. A stretch of high desert highway between Summer Lake and Silver Lake, where the sagebrush seems to grow out of the dust like it's doing you a favor. But tucked into a low basalt outcrop near the roadside, there's a panel of petroglyphs so strange, so silent, and so chronologically slippery that it continues to provoke more questions than answers. Among the more prominent figures is a horned anthropomorph human-like in body, but with exaggerated features. Wide, open arms, short legs, head topped with curving horn-like projections. Surrounding this figure are other carvings, geometric patterns, possible animals, abstract forms that might represent maps, symbols, or something entirely more conceptual. The carving styles vary, some deep and weathered, others faint and shallow. So, who made them, and when? That's where things get muddy. Radiocarbon dating doesn't work on rock. You can't scrape a petroglyph and get a number. What you can do is examine repatination, the chemical weathering that forms a dark coating on exposed rock, and compare the depth, clarity, and lichen growth across panels. By those measures, some of the picture rock pass glyphs are very old, as in 7,500 to potentially 12,000 years old, which would make them among the oldest rock art in North America. But even if the age range holds, it only deepens the mystery. Because it puts these carvings in direct temporal alignment with the Western-stemmed tradition sites, with the early sandal makers, with the occupants of Fort Rock and Connley Caves. In other words, these glyphs might be the only surviving visual expression of the very people whose tools we've been dating and debating. And yet, we don't know what they mean. Not really. Interpretations multiply like mirages. Some see shamanic figures, depictions of ritual practitioners mid-trance, their horns symbolic of transformation. Others propose clan totems or territorial markers. Still others suggest star maps, storytelling devices, or mnemonic aids for oral history. The truth is, likely all of these, and none of these, meaning isn't static. And when symbols outlive the cultures that created them, they become mirrors we see what we want to see. But the horned figure keeps showing up. Variants appear across other Great Basin rock art sites, sometimes more stylized, sometimes less. It raises the possibility of a shared symbolic language, or at least shared mythic motifs, passed across generations and geographic distances, but even then, shared by whom? That's the part the desert won't tell us. Because these petroglyphs sit at a crossroads not just geographically, but historically. Picture Rock Pass marks a natural corridor between lake basins, a pinch point through which people, animals, and stories would have traveled. It's not hard to imagine it as a kind of prehistoric signpost, or gathering site, or borderland. A liminal space, the kind of place where stories were told with stones because they couldn't be risked in words. And the placement matters. The figures are etched at about human height, clustered in accessible zones, but just far enough off the obvious path that they feel like a message meant for the observant. Not exactly hidden, but not billboarded either. You don't stumble across them, you arrive, and when you do, there's a silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something waiting. That silence has invited plenty of modern speculation. Some fringe theorists leap straight into the void aliens, Atlanteans, time travelers. But those stories say more about our hunger for spectacle than about the people who lived here. What we actually have is more subtle, a glimpse into an interior world, one that probably made perfect sense to its makers and now hovers just out of reach. It's possible these carvings had a practical purpose. Maybe they marked a boundary between groups, or a warning not to enter sacred ground. Maybe the horned figure wasn't mythical at all. Maybe it was someone's ancestor, or someone's rival, or someone's god. Or maybe it was none of those. Maybe it was just someone. Someone standing in a basin full of Ice Age water, carving a figure into stone because something had to be remembered and this was the best they could do. But if this place held that kind of importance, surely it wasn't the only one. Surely others left signs deeper, broader, etched across the same volcanic skin of Oregon's high desert. And indeed, not far from here, another site stands, larger, stranger, even more symbolically dense, where the art doesn't whisper, it roars. Greaser Petroglyph Site. There's a kind of gravity to the Greaser Petroglyph Site, not the physical kind, but the psychological one. A weight that settles on you as you stand among the carved boulders and wonder what part of yourself, exactly, is being watched. Because someone once took a lot of time to peck hundreds of symbols into basalt in the middle of a nowhere that used to be somewhere. The site sits in Oregon's southeast corner, near the base of the Sheep's Head Mountains, where desert scrub and volcanic rock meet in an uneasy truce. There's no fanfare, no guardrails. Just the wind, the heat, and the low murmur of questions left unanswered. The petroglyphs themselves range from the abstract to the tantalizingly anthropomorphic, concentric circles, wavy lines, spirals, grids, human-like forms with outstretched arms. Shapes that resemble animals, or maybe spirits, or maybe maps, or maybe nothing at all. No one knows. Which, of course, is the point. For decades, archaeologists and local tribes have debated the purpose of this symbolic explosion. Were these glyphs territorial markers, ceremonial inscriptions, hunting magic, story maps? Did they serve a mnemonic purpose? A visual cue for oral histories? Or were they spiritual signatures, each one a prayer, or a warning, or a bargain with something older than language? Dating the site is equally slippery. Like most rock art, the Greaser glyphs aren't carved into time, they're carved into rock that resists it. There's no charcoal layer to test. No buried tool to cross-reference. What we have are indirect clues. The degree of desert varnish on each carving, the style and motif comparisons with other sites, the stratigraphy of nearby occupations. Some researchers suggest certain glyphs could be over 10,000 years old. Others are likely younger, much younger, perhaps added centuries apart, maybe millennia. In that way, Greaser isn't a single moment frozen in time. It's an accumulation, a record of passing minds, each leaving their mark on the same canvas like carving a message on the same tree, generations apart, never meeting but still somehow in dialogue. That layered ambiguity raises another question. Was this a shared site? A kind of ceremonial commons between groups? Or was it bounded sacred to a particular lineage, a private language carved in a public place? There's no consensus. Some of the design's echo motifs found at other northern Great Basin sites, including Picture Rock, Pass, and Petroglyph Lake. The repetition of certain forms like spirals and horned figures hints at shared cosmology. But the differences in execution suggest local expression, dialects, not just languages. Then again, maybe we're overcomplicating it. Maybe what we're looking at is the ancient equivalent of graffiti, Spontaneous, improvisational, emotionally driven. Maybe the images weren't sacred in the way we assume. Maybe they were cathartic, or funny, or practical. Or maybe, and this is the unsettling part, they meant everything then and now mean nothing. Because the symbols weren't designed for permanence. They were designed for people who already knew what they meant. Once that shared context was gone, the glyphs became visual riddles with the clues torn out. There's a kind of tragedy in that. Not that the meaning was lost that happens, but that we still insist on solving it, as if understanding the past makes us safer in the present. But Greaser doesn't offer that comfort. It offers dissonance, layers of intent we can't quite decode, and the quiet suggestion that the people who made these marks lived by different assumptions entirely, about time, about place, about the permanence of stone. And what if that's the real message here? Not the specific content of the carvings, but the act of carving itself. The commitment to leave something behind, even when there's no guarantee it will be understood. The stubborn human habit of speaking to the future through symbols we know will blur. Because in a desert like this, permanence is an illusion. Wind grinds rock, lichen erases lines, water reclaims what fire once revealed. And yet, the glyphs remain. Faint, scarred, partial, but still undeniably there. And Greaser isn't alone. A few hundred miles to the east, perched above a vast alkaline lake, is another gallery less known, more remote, and far larger. A rock face covered in thousands of images, layered across epochs, some so weathered they seem to dissolve as you look at them. If Greaser is a sentence, Petroglyph Lake is a library, and its pages are still wide open. Hart Mountain's Petroglyph Lake? You don't stumble across Petroglyph Lake, you commit to it. Miles from anything resembling civilization, tucked into the western escarpment of Hart Mountain, it waits dry, alkaline, and brutally exposed. There's no grand approach, no ceremonial gateway. Just high desert silence and the rising sense that the landscape itself is withholding something. And then, you see it. A cliff, stained black with desert varnish, covered in carvings, thousands of them. Stretching for nearly a mile along the basalt rim, the petroglyphs at Petroglyph Lake form one of the largest concentrations of rock art in the Pacific Northwest. It's not just their number that astonishes, but their diversity. Spiral motifs, dotted grids, horned figures, rectilinear patterns that look eerily mathematical, stylized humans with elongated torsos and outstretched hands, abstract shapes that seem to vibrate with symbolic intent, and, layered beneath it all, a silent war between time and erosion. And yet, no one knows how long this has been going on. That's the mystery. Some glyphs appear older than others, their lines faint, shallow, reclaimed by time. Others are sharper, more recent, possibly added during the last few centuries. A few have been repatinated entirely, so the carvings themselves are darker than the rock they were etched into. That doesn't happen quickly. It suggests a depth of time that defies easy storytelling. But is there a sequence? A stylistic chronology? Any hope of mapping meaning across thousands of images, etched in multiple hands across multiple ages? Not yet. Unlike a single mural or site panel, Petroglyph Lake is an archive without an index. You could spend weeks here and not see the same image twice. The sheer density resists interpretation. It almost dares you to make sense of it, to impose pattern where there might be none, or where the pattern exists in a symbolic language we've long since lost. Some researchers believe the glyphs reflect different cultural phases, that earlier foragers in the late Pleistocene started the tradition, and later groups added to it, modifying old symbols, overcarving new ones, turning the cliff into a kind of long-form conversation. Others argue for ritual cycles, a place revisited during specific times of year, perhaps connected to celestial events or water levels in the basin below. Because yes, once there was water. Petroglyph Lake is dry now, a chalky bed lined with salt and silence. But during the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene, it would have been full. A seasonal, possibly permanent lake fed by snowmelt and groundwater, attracting waterfowl, game, and human visitors alike. The petroglyphs sit on what would have been the high shoreline, a kind of balcony over the life-giving waters. The implications are obvious, but unprovable, that this was a sacred place, a watching place, a remembering place. Still, the style and content of the glyphs are maddeningly non-linear. Some depict forms that echo the Western archaic tradition, others seem unique to this specific site. There are motifs mirrored at other Great Basin locations, concentric rings, stick figures, zoomorphic designs, but nothing like standardization. If there's a grammar to these symbols, we haven't cracked it. Not even close. And yet, for all the interpretive void, the effect is visceral. To stand beneath the carvings is to feel uninvited, not in a hostile way, but in a cosmic one, like you're reading someone else's diary in a language you'll never speak. Because unlike the petroglyphs at Greaser or Picture Rock Pass, which might be read as isolated messages or localized iconography, Petroglyph Lake feels like an accumulation of intention. Not just statements, but layers of symbolic labor, preserved across generations, an emotional architecture built in basalt. Why here? Why this cliff? Why this relentless act of carving? Perhaps because of what it overlooks. The lake bed, the basin, the migratory path, or perhaps because it offered permanence, a place to press memory into stone when everything else was transient. Footprints vanish, baskets decay, but rock holds. Or maybe it was something even simpler. Maybe this was a sacred wall. A vertical horizon where earth met sky, and meaning could be projected outward, a place to speak to gods, ancestors, or whatever else moved behind the clouds. You don't have to know what a glyph means to feel the hand behind it. And that's what makes Petroglyph Lake so profoundly disturbing. Not just its size or strangeness, but its confidence. Whoever made these symbols wasn't asking for permission. They weren't practicing. They were working within a framework, a visual language that mattered deeply, even if it now falls flat in our modern mouths. But if this was a library of the sacred, what else did it connect to? Because just down the canyon, where the basalt breaks and the walls shrink, lies another kind of record, not carved into stone, but painted. A different palette, a different voice, just as mysterious and just as unresolved. Picture Gorge pictographs, John Day. It begins with color. Not the rich, saturated hues of modern paints, but the ghostly remains of iron oxide and mineral washes, faded reds, muted yellows, spectral blacks clinging to basalt cliff faces, like the last thoughts of someone who lived too long ago to explain themselves. These are the pictographs of Picture Gorge, hidden in the canyonlands near the John Day River, where the land folds in on itself. Basalt cliffs tower like ancient sentinels, and time seems to hang in the air like dust after a long wind. Unlike the petroglyphs of Petroglyph Lake or Greaser site, which were carved into stone with deliberate violence, the images here were painted applied with brush, finger, or maybe reed, in a medium far less permanent and infinitely more vulnerable, which makes their survival all the more improbable. You don't see them unless you're looking, and even then, you need the right light, the right angle, and sometimes a little luck. Some have nearly vanished into the rock, oxidized and eroded by rain, sun, and time. Others remain just distinct enough to unsettle. Human forms, abstract patterns, concentric circles, wavy lines that could be snakes, rivers, or something else entirely. What they are depends on who's asking. And that's the problem. No one really knows who painted them. Various indigenous groups have ancestral ties to the region: the Northern Paiute, the Umatilla, the Cayuse, the Walla Walla, but these pictographs likely predate historical tribal boundaries. They could be 1,000 years old. or 5,000, or more. Some scholars cautiously suggest dates extending back as far as 7,000 to 10,000 years, based on pigment weathering, style comparison, and geological context. But the evidence is circumstantial. These aren't cave paintings with clear archaeological layers. They're cliff face fragments, open to the elements and stripped of their original narrative context. And yet, for all their obscurity, the picture gorge pictographs are clearly deliberate. These weren't idle doodles or random decoration. They were placed with intent, positioned on rock faces facing the river, often above reachable height, possibly to be seen from a distance or reserved for initiated eyes. They hint at performance, process, ceremony. But ceremony for what? That's the canyon's riddle. Some images appear to depict humans stick-like, angular, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. Others show patterns that may be symbolic representations of animals, spirit beings, or geographic landmarks. Still others defy classification entirely, swirls that seem to echo astronomical events, dots that might mark counting systems, lines intersecting at odd angles, like a code we forgot how to read. There's also the matter of the pigment itself. In many of the pictographs, the red is derived from hematite powdered iron ore, mixed with a binder like animal fat, blood, or plant resin. In the right conditions, this pigment can last thousands of years. But the binder? That part decays fast, which means direct dating is nearly impossible unless organic residues are trapped underneath. And those are rare, which leaves style, the ever-unreliable guide in ancient art, as the primary tool for interpreting age and origin. But styles shift. They migrate, hybridize, vanish. What looks early in one canyon might persist late in another. A motif used by one group might be adopted, altered, and reused by another centuries later. The boundary between originality and repetition becomes meaningless. So what are we left with? A few cliffs, some fading pigment, and the haunting sense that a deep tradition once existed here. Visual, spiritual, symbolic, that has now mostly evaporated. But there's something uniquely unsettling about these paintings, even more than the petroglyphs. Maybe it's the fragility. Petroglyphs confront you with permanence. They're scars in stone. But pictographs are whispers. They don't declare. They suggest. Their transience makes them feel more human, more vulnerable, like thoughts barely held together. And the landscape plays its part. Picture Gorge isn't just any canyon, it's one of the richest geologic records on Earth. Layer after layer of volcanic tuff, ash, and sediment stack like pages in a prehistoric journal. Millions of years of geologic drama, all visible in the cliff face. Fossils lie embedded in the rock just meters away from the pictographs. It's a place where time collides ancient mammals below, ancient humans above, and yet neither side can explain the other. What were the painters seeing? What were they trying to mark or call forth as they applied pigment to basalt in a canyon that had already stood for tens of millions of years? Some researchers have speculated that the pictographs represent visions, trance-induced imagery from shamanic rituals. Others suggest they're territorial or commemorative. Still others wonder if they were instructional, part of an initiatory system, a visual curriculum for spiritual or cultural education. But with no surviving oral tradition linked directly to these panels, we're left holding a brush with no canvas. And yet, they endure. Fading, yes, but still present, like memories too strong to forget and too incomplete to retell. So, if color was once used to mark meaning, if these painted ghosts still matter, then what does that say about what we've lost elsewhere? What stories didn't survive the rain? What meanings turned to dust? And perhaps more urgently, how many such stories remain buried, hidden just beneath the surface, in Oregon's driest and most improbable forests? Forests that aren't supposed to exist, that persist like rumors, like the past, refusing to obey the rules of the present. The lost forest. It doesn't look like it belongs there. A stand of ponderosa pine rising stubbornly from the sagebrush sea of central Oregon, miles from the nearest mountain slope, out of reach of reliable rain. And so isolated, it feels like it was left behind on purpose or by accident. This is the lost forest. And it's more than just a botanical curiosity. It's an ecological riddle, a living contradiction. A forest that shouldn't exist, growing where no forest should, persisting not just for decades but for millennia in one of the driest regions in the entire Pacific Northwest. Annual precipitation here averages around 9.5 inches, barely enough to keep sagebrush alive, let alone a grove of moisture-hungry pine trees. And yet, the trees are not only surviving, they're reproducing. They drop seeds, saplings sprout. Some of them make it. The forest is holding its line, a slowly shifting island of green in an ocean of dust. So how? That's the question that's baffled ecologists, hydrologists, and climate historians for generations. Because this forest isn't a remnant of modern human planting, nor a transplant from another ecosystem. It's ancient, natural, and wrong in the best possible way. The story begins, as most ancient Oregon mysteries do, with water. Long ago, during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, the Fort Rock Basin was a wetland empire. Pluvial lakes stretched for miles. Seasonal marshes expanded and contracted with snowmelt and volcanic runoff. And what's now the lost forest was once near the shoreline of an ephemeral lake system. Back then, conditions could have supported a more widespread pine woodland. But the climate shifted. The lakes dried. The rains retreated north. Most of the trees didn't make it. But these did. Why? The leading theory is groundwater that beneath the dunes and pumice, a shallow aquifer still runs like a forgotten river. Hydrologic surveys suggest that ancient water, trapped in the sediments of vanished lakes, may still feed the roots of the lost forest from below. Not enough to create a new woodland, but just enough to keep this one from disappearing. But even this explanation isn't fully satisfying. For one thing, soil composition around the forest is harsh, sandy, alkaline, nutrient-poor. It drains too fast. Ponderosa pines prefer volcanic loam and mountain slopes, not desert flats. And yet, these trees don't just survive here, they behave as if they belong. Growth rings show steady patterns. Insect populations are balanced. Fire hasn't wiped it out. There's no obvious ecological crisis. Then there's the spatial oddity. The forest isn't spreading. Not really. It's not invading the surrounding desert or reclaiming lost ground. Its edges remain weirdly stable, retreating in some areas and creeping forward in others, but never dramatically changing. This suggests a kind of equilibrium, like the system is locked into a delicate pact with the landscape, one that no one quite understands. Add to that the lack of nearby relatives. The nearest significant ponderosa pine populations are dozens of miles away, separated by open desert and geological barriers. That isolation means the lost forest is genetically distinct, a micropopulation that's been evolving on its own terms for thousands of years. Which raises even more questions. Is this forest a relic from a cooler, wetter era now persisting through sheer biological inertia? Is it an example of hyperlocal adaptation trees that have genetically adapted to survive in desert-like conditions through slow, selective success? Or is it something else entirely, the product of subtle hydrological forces no one's fully mapped yet? Some scientists have floated more speculative ideas, that wind-drifted snowmelt from distant ranges may concentrate here under just the right conditions. That historical beaver activity, long since vanished, may have altered groundwater flow centuries ago. That tectonic microfaults could redirect subterranean water in ways too fine for satellite data to detect. But even with remote sensing, hydrology modeling, and aerial surveys, the full story remains buried under bark, beneath root, inside the aquifer. What's certain is that the lost forest is not just a forest. It's a memory. A living echo of a time when Oregon's desert wasn't so dry, when water flowed in unexpected places, and when the land held different secrets. And now, as the climate changes again faster, less predictably the forest becomes a kind of canary in a coal mine, except this canary has needles, not feathers. It survives, for now. But survival, in this part of the world, is never passive. It's active resistance. The lost forest isn't just a relic, it's a question. What else have we misjudged about Oregon's so-called deserts? What other anomalies are hiding in plain sight, waiting to be noticed before they disappear? And if life could cling here against the odds, against the data, what might that say about the landforms just beyond the tree line? Features that aren't alive, but behave like they are. Patterns in the soil that form with no clear cause. Geological riddles arranged in rows. The next mystery doesn't speak in chlorophyll. It speaks in bumps, in mounds, in inexplicable humps across the landscape that seem to rise of their own will and refuse to be explained. Mima mounds of the Pacific Northwest, including Oregon. They rise like quiet questions. Dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of low, rounded mounds scattered across open landscapes, perfectly spaced, stubbornly uniform, and almost aggressively unexplained. From the air, they look like a lunar surface reimagined by a compulsive minimalist. On foot, they feel like walking through a room full of unspoken rules. These are Mima mounds named after Mima Prairie in Washington state, but also scattered throughout Oregon's Willamette Valley, Klamath Basin, and parts of the high desert. If you've driven through certain patches of the Pacific Northwest and thought, why does the ground look like a giant bubble wrap? You've seen them. And if you've asked why they exist, congratulations, you've joined a 200-year-old debate with no satisfying answers. Each mound is modest in scale, usually about 3 to 6 feet tall and 10 to 30 feet wide, but together they cover vast tracts of land. They seem patterned, almost organized, as though following instructions no one left behind. You can walk through them for hours and never quite shake the feeling that they're supposed to mean something. So, what makes them? That's where the trouble begins. Theories about Mima mounds fall into 4 general categories: biological, geological, seismic, and ecological self-organization. Each one has supporters, each one has problems. Let's go through the contenders and why none of them quite stick. 1. The gopher hypothesis. This is the most persistent theory and, oddly, the most controversial. It suggests that Mima mounds are the long-term byproduct of burrowing rodents, particularly pocket gophers. The idea is that these creatures excavate soil upward as they build tunnels and push earth out of their burrows. Over time, as in centuries or even millennia, the soil accumulates into mounds. Simple, right? Not quite. The gopher theory hits a few snags. First, gophers are found in many places where Mima mounds don't exist. Second, gophers are not known for creating such uniform spacing between mounds. Third, in many mound fields, no current gopher activity exists, and in some, it's likely they never did. Lastly, the sheer volume of soil in each mound far exceeds what one little rodent could move in a single lifetime. Supporters counter that gopher behavior, over generations and in the right soil conditions, could explain the gradual buildup. That microtopographic changes, water pooling in low spots, vegetation growing differently, could reinforce the mound structure. It's possible, but it still doesn't explain all Mima mounds, just some. 2. Periglacial processes. Here, we enter the Ice Age. Some researchers propose that the mounds formed during the late Pleistocene, when freeze-thaw cycles churned soils in periglacial environments. As water in the soil froze, expanded, and thawed again, it could have created a kind of soil ripple, eventually building into mounds through repeated upheaval. It's a tidy explanation for certain northern fields. But in Oregon, some mounds exist well south of the glacial reach. Others occur in areas with no evidence of prolonged permafrost or freeze-thaw activity. Plus, if this process were universal, why aren't Mima mounds found all over other formerly glaciated landscapes? It feels close, but not quite there. 3. Earthquakes. Another contender. Seismic shaking. This theory argues that strong earthquakes could liquefy soil layers, causing material to bubble up and settle in mound-like forms, sort of like natural sand boils. In areas with repeated seismic activity, such as the Pacific Northwest's Cascadia subduction zone, this could explain localized mound fields. But again, problems arise. Mima mounds are often too regular, too gently sloped, and too consistent in composition to match known earthquake-induced features. Liquefaction leaves a mess. These mounds are clean, even elegant. Also, there's no direct evidence, no fault lines, no disrupted layers, no signature of seismic violence beneath them. 4. Self-organizing ecology. This is the most modern and perhaps the most poetic theory. According to models in landscape ecology, certain natural systems self-organize. That is, small variations in soil moisture, plant cover, or animal behavior can trigger feedback loops, positive and negative, that create larger patterns over time. Think termite mounds, fairy circles, or ripple marks in sand dunes. It doesn't take intelligence, just persistence. Applied to Mima mounds, this theory suggests that vegetation, water flow, and soil movement interact over long periods to produce stable, repeating forms. Grasses might grow better on slightly elevated ground, encouraging animals to burrow there, which adds more soil, which grows more grass, and so on. The math checks out in models. The trouble is, real-world confirmation remains elusive. No one's yet recorded the full cycle of mound formation from scratch, which makes it feel like explaining a magic trick using probability, elegant but unsatisfying. What unites all these theories is one fact: no one has conclusively proven any of them. And so the mounds remain dotted across Oregon's landscape, like punctuation marks in a forgotten language. They don't hold artifacts. They don't contain bones. They're made of the same material as the soil around them. But they persist, defying erosion, resisting interpretation, and hinting at a kind of slow intelligence operating just below the threshold of understanding. And perhaps that's the most disturbing possibility of all, that the land can think in decades, in centuries, in subtle patterns, that not everything mysterious is ancient in the way we expect. Some riddles evolve, some answers build themselves in silence. But if you really want to see nature in chaos, not order if you want to watch land pulled apart in hours rather than centuries, you have to leave the gentle curves of the Mima fields behind and follow the scars of a flood so violent it reshaped entire valleys. Because the next mystery didn't form slowly. It arrived like judgment. Ice Age floods into the Willamette Valley. Imagine a wall of water, not a metaphorical one, not poetic, but a literal cataclysm. A flood so massive it didn't just overtop rivers or overflow lakes. It ripped through entire states, reshaped valleys, moved boulders the size of houses, and buried forests under hundreds of feet of silt. Now imagine it didn't happen once. It happened dozens of times. This is the story, or rather, the enduring enigma of the Ice Age megafloods that surged across the Pacific Northwest at the end of the last glacial period, around 15,000 to 12,000 years ago. They were born far to the northeast, from a source that sounds more myth than science: Glacial Lake Missoula, a vast, ice-dammed lake in what is now Montana. Held back by an ice wall nearly a half-mile tall, the lake eventually breached its frozen dam, and when it did, all hell broke loose. The water didn't trickle, it exploded. An estimated 500 cubic miles of water, equivalent to all of Lake Ontario, plus more, emptied in a matter of days, racing westward at speeds approaching 60 miles per hour, carving what we now call the channeled scablands of eastern Washington. It blasted through canyons, tore out rock, and then, as if following some apocalyptic GPS, it turned south into Oregon. And here's where the mystery really begins. What happened when those floodwaters reached the Willamette Valley? This valley, now a gentle landscape of farmland, wine country, and sleepy rivers, became temporarily and repeatedly a massive inland sea. The floodwaters spilled into the valley from the Columbia River, blocked by narrow volcanic bottlenecks and forced to backfill, turning the entire region into a temporary lake, now known as Lake Allison. But just how many flood pulses reached this far south? And what were their peak stages, the true height of the water? That's where the science gets surprisingly fuzzy. Geologists have mapped the silt layers, traced the flood deposits, even located stranded ice-rafted boulders far from their source. But the sedimentary record in the Willamette Valley is, to put it gently, a mess. Layer upon layer of slackwater deposits the fine silts and sands dropped when floodwaters slowed blanket the valley floor. But they don't form a clean, laminated sequence. They're disrupted, overprinted, partial. Some sections suggest a single, massive flood. Others hint at multiple distinct events, separated by years, centuries, or even millennia. The floodwaters may have surged through the Columbia Gorge in at least 40 separate pulses, with each event possibly backflooding into Oregon, but how far, how often, and how high remain contested. One theory posits that the Willamette Valley saw at least 610 major backflooding events, with water depths exceeding 400 feet in some areas. Others suggest even more events, but with varying intensities, some catastrophic, others more modest. Complicating the picture is the role of ice-rafted debris, giant boulders and erratics carried inside massive icebergs that drifted into the valley during the floods. As the icebergs melted, they dropped their rocky cargo in strange, solitary places, sometimes miles from any matching geology. The distribution of these erratics offers tantalizing clues about flood routes and high water marks, but even those patterns are inconsistent. Why does it matter? Because understanding how many floods occurred and how powerful they were would give us a clearer picture of the landscape's transformation and, possibly, the human response to it. That's right, humans. There's increasing evidence that people were already in the region when some of these floods occurred. The earliest occupation sites in Oregon Rimrock Draw, Connley Caves, Connley Caves, suggest that small groups were living, hunting, and moving through the high desert and valleys at the same time. These cataclysms were rewriting the terrain. What did they see? What did they remember? Did they tell stories about water that covered the hills? About boulders that fell from melting mountains? About forests that drowned overnight? There's no surviving oral tradition that clearly maps onto the Missoula floods, but the idea that people witnessed or at least inherited memories of these events is no longer far-fetched. In a world already shaped by uncertainty, an inland sea appearing without warning might have been the ultimate divine punctuation. But even if no humans watched the floods come in, the landscape never forgot. The Willamette Valley, serene and bucolic today, is underlain by chaos sediment dumped by water moving too fast for comprehension. Farms now grow where lake-bottom mud once settled. Towns sit atop gravel fans laid down in the span of a single catastrophic week. And yet, for all our mapping, we still can't say for sure. How many times did this happen? How deep did the waters go? How far did they reach into the heart of Oregon? The data resists certainty. So we do what humans have always done. We name it something tidy, like Lake Allison, and pretend that explains it. But of course, it doesn't. Because if you want to truly understand the scope of this flooding, you can't just look at the valley. You have to follow the edges, the places where water paused, pooled, and deposited its signature. You have to measure its ghosts. And that leads to the next riddle. How high did Lake Allison really climb, and what kind of world did it leave behind in its retreat? Lake Allison, backflooding of the Willamette Valley. If you've ever driven through the Willamette Valley and thought, This is oddly flat. You're not imagining it. The terrain here is strangely subdued, like someone tried to iron out the earth. From Portland to Eugene, the land spreads in wide, even stretches, occasionally interrupted by isolated hills that feel more like stubborn leftovers than part of any coherent topography. There's a reason for that. It's called Lake Allison, a name that sounds quaint, almost pastoral, like something from a retirement brochure, but Lake Allison was no lake in the traditional sense. It was a temporary inland sea, and it came into being in the aftermath of something profoundly violent. It formed when the Ice Age megafloods, the same ones that bulldozed their way across Washington, slammed into the narrow corridor of the Columbia River Gorge. That bottleneck caused the floodwaters to surge back into the Willamette Valley, unable to escape quickly enough. What happened next was not slow or scenic. It was geologic panic. Water, with nowhere to go, surged southward, spreading across the valley floor, submerging what today would be entire cities and farmlands. The name Lake Allison is a modern invention, coined by geologist Ira Allison, who first recognized the massive scale of this temporary body of water in the mid-20th century. But the lake itself? It didn't just appear once. It likely formed many times, possibly dozens, each time the Missoula floods found their way into the valley. Every flood brought new water, new sediment, new chaos. But here's the problem. We still don't know exactly what this lake looked like. Its precise extent, maximum depth, duration, and the sequence of formation remain subjects of active debate. Reconstructions based on flood deposits, erratic boulders, and high water marks suggest that Lake Allison may have been over 400 feet deep in some areas, stretching from Portland all the way to Eugene. But how stable was it? Did each flood create a single unified lake, or did the valley fill in stages, with disconnected ponds and eddies pooling behind hills and ridges? Did the water stand for days, weeks, or merely hours? How quickly did it drain, and how did its formation change across multiple flood episodes? These questions matter because Lake Allison wasn't just a passive basin. It actively reshaped the Willamette Valley's landscape. The standing water dropped massive quantities of fine-grained sediment, creating the rich alluvial soils that now support Oregon's famed agriculture. Willamette Valley Pinot Noir owes its complexity, in part, to the chaos of an Ice Age flood. But those sediments also obscure the flood's story. They make it difficult to reconstruct the layers, to tease apart which deposits came from which flood, to identify exactly how many distinct lake stages formed over time. Some places show laminated silts that look like quiet water sat for a while. Others show signs of rapid drawdown slumps, erosional features, and cut banks that indicate the water vanished quickly, as if someone pulled the plug. Then there are the stranded hills, isolated ridges that poked above the floodwaters, like islands. Today, they're just outcroppings, minor elevations. But during Lake Allison's formation, they may have been refuges, dry land in a drowned world. Did animals gather on them? Did early humans flee to them? Did anyone survive the flood by watching the world vanish from atop what we now call Chehalem Ridge or Waldo Hills? We don't know. What we do know is that every time Lake Allison formed, it was a temporary punctuation in the landscape, a full stop in the valley's normal life. Then, as quickly as it came, it drained. The waters receded. The sediments settled, and the flood forgot it had ever been there. But it left behind signs like footprints in wet concrete. And some of the most revealing of those signs are not hills or layers, but boulders carried far beyond their home, dropped in the strangest places, like messages from glaciers in transit. Which leads us to the next mystery. Because if Lake Allison left silt in its wake, it also left erratics, big ones, and they're not where they're supposed to be. Ice-rafted erratics. There's a giant boulder sitting in an Oregon vineyard that does not belong there. It's not native, it's not local, it's not even from the same tectonic plate, geologically speaking. It just appeared. Dropped off like lost luggage in the middle of the Willamette Valley. It's called an ice-rafted erratic, And it's part of a much larger mystery. Scattered across western Oregon in fields, hillsides, suburban backyards, and forgotten woods are hundreds of boulders that don't match the surrounding geology. Some are made of granite, others of quartzite, gneiss, or argillite. Their nearest source points lie hundreds of miles away in the northern Rockies of Idaho, Montana, and southern British Columbia. So how did they get here? Short answer, they hitched a ride on a glacier. Longer, more disturbing answer, they rode icebergs through a prehistoric flood. Here's how it works. During the height of the Missoula floods, as glacial Lake Missoula released its immense payload of water, enormous icebergs broke off from collapsing ice dams. Many of these bergs were embedded with debris, including boulders ripped from mountainsides. As these floating blocks of ice traveled downstream, carried by the ferocious momentum of the flood, they drifted wherever the flood waters took them. When those waters backed into the Willamette Valley and formed Lake Allison, the icebergs floated across its surface, slow, majestic, and laden with geological stowaways. Then, as the flood waters receded, the icebergs grounded, melted, and released their cargo. One boulder here, another miles away, a third halfway up a hillside, seemingly placed by a confused god. This explains the erratic part. These rocks don't fit their surroundings. They're misplaced, anomalous, geological orphans with no local origin. But even here, there's a deeper question. Why are some of these erratics clustered while others are completely isolated? Why do some appear in tight groups, almost like they were dropped from the same melting barge, while others sit utterly alone, far from any apparent flood route? The answer might lie in the complex hydrodynamics of Lake Allison. Water didn't fill the valley like soup in a bowl. It moved. It swirled. It eddied. It crept into pockets and surged through constrictions. Icebergs may have drifted into still water zones and melted together, dropping multiple erratics in one place. Elsewhere, a single iceberg may have drifted far before melting and releasing its solitary payload. The pattern of these erratics may reflect the microcurrents of a vanished sea, a frozen map of circulation we'll never fully reconstruct. Some boulders sit at elevations of 400 feet or more, suggesting maximum flood stage. Others lie below, hinting at lower pulses. If we could match each boulder's geochemical fingerprint to its source in the northern Rockies, we might reconstruct their drift paths, the exact voyage each iceberg took before it fell apart. And yet, we haven't. Because tracing that story requires precise data, long fieldwork, and the willingness to admit we're working with fragments, breadcrumbs, left by glaciers during an event we still don't fully understand. The erratics of Oregon are silent, but not meaningless. They tell a story of movement, violence, displacement, and strangely stillness, because once they dropped, they never moved again. They became fixed points in a landscape that's still puzzling over how they got there. But one erratic, in particular, stands out. It's big, too big, and it tells a story not just of movement but of metal. Iron, specifically. A rock so strange and so heavy, it doesn't just break the rules of local geology. It might have fallen from space. Willamette meteorite, Tominos. It does not belong here. Weighing in at over 15.5 tons, riddled with deep thumbprint-shaped pits called regmaglyphs and composed almost entirely of iron and nickel, the Willamette meteorite is unlike anything else in Oregon's landscape, or, for that matter, in its geology. It's the largest meteorite ever found in North America, and the 6th largest in the world. But its size isn't its most bizarre feature. It's the fact that it was found nowhere near where it fell. Discovered in 1902 near present-day West Lynn, Oregon, sitting conspicuously on the ground, partially buried but not embedded in a crater, the Willamette meteorite has no obvious local impact site. There's no blast radius, no shock-metamorphosed bedrock, no cosmic debris field. Just a massive hunk of extraterrestrial metal, quietly rusting on a hillside. So, how did it get there? The prevailing theory is almost too strange to believe. The meteorite likely landed somewhere in Canada or Montana long before the end of the last ice age, possibly over 20,000 years ago, crashing into an ice sheet rather than bare earth. Its tremendous velocity was absorbed not by solid ground, but by thousands of feet of compacted glacial ice. No crater, no fireworks, just a muffled cosmic thud into frozen silence. Once encased in the glacier, the meteorite was gradually absorbed into the icy flow, moving, drifting, and eventually calving off as part of a glacial iceberg into glacial Lake Missoula. When the Missoula floods broke free, that iceberg carrying the embedded meteorite was swept westward with the surge. It floated down the Columbia River, backed into the Willamette Valley with the floodwaters, and finally grounded and melted, releasing the meteorite into the Oregon landscape. In other words, it didn't fall from space onto Oregon. It floated into it. This makes the Willamette meteorite not only a cosmic artifact, but a geological hitchhiker, a rare example of extraterrestrial material transported by terrestrial ice across thousands of miles through the most violent freshwater flood events in Earth's history. And yet, for all its journeying, it remained unburied, unshattered, and eventually unclaimed, at least in modern times, until settlers stumbled upon it in the early 20th century. But for the Clackamas Chinook people, the meteorite, which they named Tomanowos, meaning heavenly visitor or sky person, was anything but a mystery. It was sacred, a spiritual being, not an object. A direct link between the earth and the cosmos, used in ceremonies, revered as a symbol of power and healing. Its removal by colonists and subsequent display in the American Museum of Natural History led to decades of protest, cultural negotiation, and eventually a shared agreement. Today, while the meteorite still resides in New York, tribal members have annual visitation rights, and its status as Tomanowos, not just a rock, but a being, has been legally and spiritually recognized. And still, the meteorite raises questions science hasn't fully answered. Where exactly did it impact? How long was it locked in the ice before it moved? Which flood carried it into Oregon the first? The last? One of the many in between? Even the process by which it came to rest in such a specific spot on a hillside, not far above modern flood levels, remains a hydrodynamic puzzle. Icebergs don't drift in straight lines. Meteorites don't politely disembark. And yet, here it was. Perhaps the most unsettling part isn't how it arrived, but that we almost missed it. That a 15-ton piece of space metal could quietly settle into a wooded hillside and sit there for centuries, unbothered, waiting to be found, like a secret the Earth didn't know it was keeping. And if something that large can go unnoticed, what else did the floodwaters bring in? What else was deposited not just in fields and forests, but halfway up the hillsides? If Lake Allison reached 400 feet in depth and icebergs wandered across its breadth, then what other stones, strange or otherwise, might be stranded across the Oregon landscape? That brings us to the next mystery. A boulder not from space, but still entirely out of place, sitting alone, halfway up a hill in the middle of wine country, raising the same old question. What is this rock doing here? Bellevue erratic rock, at to 300 feet elevation. It's not dramatic at first glance. No glowing metal, no mystic aura, just a big, slightly mossy boulder sitting in a field near McMinnville, Oregon, surrounded by vineyards and picnic tables. A friendly park sign calls it erratic rock. Locals bring sandwiches and kids. It's a nice place to walk your dog. But the rock itself is anomalous. It's made of granite, a type of rock not found anywhere near the Willamette Valley. Its geologic origin is traced to somewhere in the northern Rockies, possibly British Columbia, hundreds of miles away. It doesn't belong on this hilltop. It doesn't belong in this valley, and it certainly doesn't belong at 300 feet above sea level. So, again, how did it get here? The answer, once more, lies in the floodwaters. during one of the Missoula flood events, or perhaps several icebergs drifted into the Willamette Valley, carrying debris plucked from faraway mountains. As Lake Allison pooled behind the constricted Columbia River outlet, icebergs floated on its surface, rising and falling with the water levels. When the flood receded, stranded bergs melted and dropped their rocky passengers. The Bellevue erratic was one of them. Its current elevation tells us something crucial. It marks one of the maximum high water lines of Lake Allison. At approximately 300 feet, it offers physical, unmoving evidence of just how deep the water once was, how far it reached up Oregon's rolling hills, how thoroughly it transformed the valley. But again, nothing is simple. Why this boulder? Why here? Why is it alone? Unlike many erratics, which appear in clusters or align with known flood paths, the Bellevue erratic stands out for its singularity. It's just one big rock, oddly perched, as if dropped from a careless hand. Some geologists believe its position could be the result of a rare eddy, a momentary stillwater pocket in the backflood, where an iceberg grounded as the waters briefly paused. Others argue it reflects the path of a berg that had drifted into a narrow corridor before melting. Either way, its position at 300 feet aligns with other flood markers, reinforcing the broader picture. Lake Allison wasn't a shallow pond. It was a monstrous inland sea with icebergs large enough to carry rocks heavier than most cars and melt them onto Oregon's wine country hills. Today, the rock is a tourist attraction. It has a plaque, a walking trail, a name. But it's also a geologic crime scene, silent evidence of a flood so massive we still haven't accounted for all the debris it left behind. And there's another thing. The Bellevue erratic isn't sitting in a crater or a floodplain. It's sitting on a slope, a tuff-covered hill that was once the shoreline of something far more dangerous than a lake. Because just east of here, amid the dust and sagebrush, a different kind of geological riddle took shape, not moved by water, but born from fire. An explosive encounter between molten rock and standing water. A moment caught mid-eruption, and it left behind a circle, a ring, a blast shape in the earth. A question, preserved in stone. Fort Rock tuff ring in a shallow Ice Age lake. It looks like a caldera that forgot to finish collapsing, a vast, low ring of craggy black tuff rising from the basin floor, wide, circular, and oddly theatrical. From a distance, Fort Rock seems like the crumbling foundation of a forgotten fortress. From above, it resembles an eye, staring up blankly from the desert. But it's not a ruin. It's a geological ghost, the leftover shell of a hydrovolcanic explosion that happened when something hot magma met something wet water, and the result was immediate, loud, and violent. Fort Rock isn't just a scenic overlook. It's a tuff ring, a volcanic structure formed during a brief but chaotic eruption when rising basaltic magma hit the shallow waters of a late Pleistocene lake that once filled the Fort Rock Basin. Think steam explosion on a continental scale. Ash, gas, water, rock, all blasted skyward, only to rain down and form a ring-shaped pile of compacted debris. That's tough. Not tough, but volcanic ash fused into rock by pressure and heat. Here's where the mystery begins. What exactly were the lake conditions at the moment of eruption? And more critically, what does this interaction reveal about the Ice Age climate and hydrology of the Fort Rock Basin and the people who might have been living nearby? We know the Fort Rock tuff ring formed around 50,000 to 100,000 years ago, based on radiometric dating of the surrounding volcanic layers. At the time, the Fort Rock Basin was not the dry, windswept landscape we see today, but part of a larger pluvial lake system formed by melting glaciers and cooler, wetter conditions during the late Pleistocene. The water levels were inconsistent, waxing and waning with every climatic hiccup. But when the eruption happened, there was enough water in the basin to cause serious steam-driven mayhem. Geologists estimate that the lake may have been only 30 to 100 feet deep at the time. Shallow, but widespread. This matters, because it means the magma didn't rise into deep, stable water, which would have simply quenched it. Instead, it encountered that thin, unstable layer, the perfect zone for explosive interaction. The eruption sent material flying out in all directions, layering the area in ash, lapilli, and tuff, eventually creating the ring we now call Fort Rock. But here's the question that won't go away. Exactly, what was the step-by-step sequence of events? Did the lake level fluctuate before the eruption? Did multiple eruptions create layered rings? Were there humans nearby who might have witnessed or later inhabited the post-eruption shoreline? These aren't trivial questions. The presence of sandal fragments and ancient cultural material found inside Fort Rock Cave, located near the base of the ring, suggests that early humans did indeed return to this site long after the eruption. But what did they see when they came back? Did the ring already look the way it does now, scarred, hollowed out, a broken crown on a lake bed? Or was it partially submerged, a series of volcanic islands in a receding lake? How high was the water? And how long did it take the crater walls to erode into the jagged forms we see today? Some geologists have proposed that Fort Rock may not be a single tough ring, but a composite structure, formed by multiple eruptive phases interacting with fluctuating lake levels. Others argue for a single catastrophic event, followed by millennia of erosion and sedimentation. But the true lake level at the moment of eruption remains a moving target. Adding to the intrigue, there are other tuff rings nearby, small, collapsed siblings scattered across the basin, each with their own eruption stories, all triggered by the same unstable dance between heat and water. Together, they paint a picture of a violently dynamic landscape, one where water wasn't a serene background element, but an active participant in earth-shaping processes. Fort Rock isn't just a geological feature, it's a timestamp. It locks in a moment when climate, hydrology, and volcanism collided, a moment we still don't fully understand. And if we're asking questions about what this basin looked like before the Holocene, we can't ignore what was happening just off the Oregon coast, where a very different kind of collision was quietly building toward a reckoning. Not fire meeting water, but tectonic plates locking in silence, waiting to release a force strong enough to reshape entire shorelines. And the only thing more dangerous than that kind of energy is not knowing when it's coming. Cascadia subduction zone. Before 1700. It's not a question of if. It's never been a question of if. The real question has always been when. And perhaps even more unsettling, how often has it happened before? The Cascadia subduction zone, stretching from northern California to southern British Columbia, is one of the most dangerous tectonic features in North America. A 600-mile-long megathrust fault where the Juan de Fuca plate is slowly diving, or more accurately, being shoved beneath the North American plate. It moves at about the speed your fingernails grow. But when it finally slips, the results are catastrophic. In 1700, it did just that. A full margin rupture, possibly the entire length of the fault, released centuries of built-up strain in a matter of minutes. Coastal forests drowned, rivers surged backward, shorelines dropped, and across the Pacific, in Japan, an orphan tsunami struck without warning, a wall of water with no local earthquake to explain it. The only explanation came centuries later, when scientists realized it had started here. But what about before 1700? That's where the mystery lies. How often did these massive earthquakes occur before written records began? And just as crucially, were they always full margin ruptures, or did smaller, more localized quakes strike parts of the fault more frequently? These aren't academic questions. They define the risk. To answer them, scientists turn to paleoseismology, the study of ancient earthquakes through their sedimentary and geomorphic signatures. In Cascadia, that means digging into coastal marshes, estuaries, and offshore turbidites, looking for traces of sudden subsidence, tsunami sand sheets, and underwater landslides. What they've found is sobering. Cascadia doesn't just rupture every 500 to 600 years. It ruptures in complex patterns. Some events span the full fault, like in 1700. Others appear to affect only the southern section, or just the northern half. The recurrence intervals vary wildly from as short as 250 years to as long as 1,200. This variability complicates everything: modeling, emergency planning, even storytelling. And while offshore sediment cores have revealed a surprisingly regular sequence of turbidites, underwater landslides triggered by seismic shaking, there's still debate over how well these correlate with onshore evidence. Matching the two records requires precision, and in a region defined by rain, erosion, and dynamic coastal processes, precision is always a struggle. Compounding the mystery is the uncertainty about rupture modes. Did some earthquakes release only part of the built-up stress? Were there slow earthquakes, long-duration events that slipped quietly without shaking? Did ancient peoples living along the coast experience foreshocks, aftershocks, or clustered quakes that defy modern categorization? Archaeological evidence is thin but suggestive. Some sites show signs of abrupt abandonment. Oral traditions among indigenous peoples describe ground shaking, flooding, and the loss of entire coastal villages, memories encoded in myth but grounded in experience. Still, the timeline remains incomplete. How many Cascadia megathrust quakes occurred in the last 10,000 years? How big were they? And when will the next one strike? We don't know. We only know that we're in the gap between events, and the silence is ticking. But as we look toward the past, we find strange clues in the land ghost forests, buried shorelines, and layers of tsunami sand that refuse to explain themselves easily. Layers that suggest not just a past catastrophe, but a deeply mapped memory of motion and drowning. Because if the subduction zone was active before 1700, and it was then the coast itself has recorded its story. And part of that story is still standing, ankle deep in salt water, where roots grow sideways and trees refuse to fall. Prehistoric tsunami run-ups. In Oregon, the coastline lies to the west, but the danger comes from below. Hidden beneath the continental shelf, in the dark quiet of the Cascadia subduction zone, is the potential for devastation that doesn't start with fire or wind, but with the sudden rearrangement of the earth itself. And when that rearrangement happens, the ocean doesn't stay where it belongs. Tsunamis are not waves in the usual sense. They don't curl and crash like surf. They arrive as walls of moving sea, sometimes preceded by eerie withdrawals of water, other times without warning. And while the 1,700 tsunami is the best documented in Oregon's pre-modern history, thanks to Japanese records and coastal geomorphology, it was almost certainly not the first. So how many tsunamis have struck the Oregon coast in prehistory? How far did they reach inland? And can we ever really know? That's where the tsunami run-up mystery begins, because the earth may forget, but the land keeps score if you know how to read it. Along Oregon's coastal estuaries, low-lying marshes, and buried shorelines, geologists have discovered distinct layers of sand, sharp, sudden deposits of marine sediment sitting atop peat or soil, often mixed with marine microfossils. These aren't slow, wind-driven accumulations. They're event deposits, laid down in minutes by massive waves. These tsunami sand sheets are found in places like Netarts Bay, Alsea Bay, Coos Bay, and even farther inland in estuarine lagoons. Some are just a few centimeters thick. Others are over half a meter. They're usually poorly sorted, meaning they contain a mix of fine silt, sand, and small debris, and often taper inland, giving clues to the run-up distance. How far and how high the water moved from the original coastline. Here's the strange part. Many of these tsunami deposits don't line up neatly with one another. One estuary may show evidence for 6 major tsunami events in the last 3,500 years. Another, just 100 kilometers away, might show only 3 or none at all. This variability raises 2 unsettling possibilities. Not every tsunami leaves a clear trace in every location. Some tsunami deposits may have eroded away or remain buried where we haven't looked yet. That means the actual number of prehistoric tsunamis to strike Oregon and the heights of their run-ups is probably underestimated. Estimates based on modeling and field evidence suggest that some of these waves may have reached 10 to 30 meters in vertical height at certain locations, with inundation zones extending several kilometers inland. That's not just beaches and ports. That's entire lowland valleys temporarily underwater. In some cases, evidence suggests that tsunami waters surged into freshwater wetlands, overtopped sand dunes, and even carried marine debris into forested zones, where salt water killed off trees for decades after the event. One particularly dramatic example from the southern coast shows a massive sand sheet layered above rooted trees, which were suddenly drowned and buried, leaving their stumps preserved in tidal flats. This ties into another problem: differentiating tsunami deposits from storm surge. Major storms can also push water inland, deposit sand, and kill off vegetation. So, how can we be sure these were tsunamis and not just rogue weather events? The answer lies in context, the presence of offshore marine fossils, the abruptness of the sand layer, the lack of prior erosion, and, crucially, the repetition. Some sites show a recurring pattern: peaty marsh soil, then clean sand, then more peat. This rhythm suggests episodic inundation, not seasonal variation. Still, interpretation is tricky. Every tsunami acts differently, depending on coastline shape, seafloor gradient, river mouths, and local geology. A village spared by one wave might be destroyed by the next, depending on the angle of impact and how much sediment it carries. No two tsunami run-ups behave identically. But what they all share is the ability to remake the land in an afternoon. And in places like Neskowin, that remaking has been fossilized into something even stranger: a warning made of roots. A forest that didn't die from fire or logging, but from the ground itself sinking all at once. Because if tsunami deposits raise questions about how far the sea traveled, the ghost forests of Oregon ask an even more unsettling one. What happens when the land disappears beneath your feet? Neskowin, ghost forest. At low tide, they rise from the sand like accusations. Dozens of old-growth tree stumps stunted, barnacle-encrusted, stubborn, emerging from the surf on the beach near Neskowin, Oregon. They look ancient, and they are. They look out of place, and they are. They look like a message, and maybe they are. This is the Neskowin Ghost Forest, one of the most famous and most visually arresting examples of coastal subsidence on the Oregon shore. These trees, mostly Sitka spruce, didn't grow in the ocean. They weren't always waterlogged stumps. Once, they stood in a coastal forest, rooted in rich soil above sea level, overlooking the Pacific. Then, one day on the 26th of January 1700 to be exact, the ground beneath them dropped. Literally, in minutes. That night, the Cascadia subduction zone released a megathrust earthquake, likely with a magnitude of 8.7 to 9.2. In its wake, parts of the Oregon coast subsided by up to 2 meters. That's not erosion. That's the entire landmass being shoved downward by tectonic forces. When that happened, the forest floor dropped below the tidal zone, and seawater rushed in. The trees died. Quickly. Salt water does that. But the stumps didn't rot, not entirely. The same ocean that killed them also preserved them, burying their bases in layers of sand and sediment, sealing them away from oxygen and decay. For 3 centuries, they lay hidden beneath the beach until a series of violent winter storms in the late 1990s stripped the overburden away and the forest re-emerged. Today, tourists walk among the stumps like archaeologists in a drowned cathedral. They take photos. They skip stones. Most don't realize that they're standing on a timeline, a natural ledger of Oregon's last great seismic disaster. And here's the twist. Neskowin isn't unique. Similar ghost forests have been found all along the Pacific Northwest coast at Netarts, Nehalem, Alsia, Yaquina, and other estuaries. In each case, the pattern is the same: sudden subsidence, saltwater intrusion, death of coastal trees, preservation under tidal sediments. But Neskowin remains the most iconic, partly because the stumps are visible, partly because their preservation is so precise. Many still have visible root systems. Some show growth rings that record centuries of life before their abrupt demise. Others are charred, suggesting they may have survived earlier fires, only to be drowned by a different kind of disaster. And yet, even with all this data, we still don't know the exact amount and rate of subsidence during the 1700 quake. Estimates range from 1 to 2 meters, but whether the drop was instant, segmented, or variable across the coastline remains debated. How did the forest die all at once, or in a slow drowning over days? Was the tsunami the killing blow, or did the ground fall first? The preserved stumps offer a frozen moment in time, but interpreting that moment isn't simple. Tides, storms, sedimentation, and biological decay all obscure the finer details. Still, Nescoen's ghost forest whispers a clear message. This has happened before, and it will happen again. Because tectonic plates don't sleep. They store energy, and eventually, they release it. Just like in 1700, just like in the centuries before. And somewhere in that silent history, in the shifting records of sea and soil, we find one last unsettling question. Do the records beneath the ocean match the stories onshore? Or are we still only seeing half the disaster? Offshore versus onshore records. What happens when the land forgets, but the ocean remembers? When it comes to reconstructing Oregon's seismic past, geologists have been reading 2 books written in entirely different languages, one inscribed in mudflats, marshes, and ghost forests along the coast. The other buried beneath the ocean floor, locked inside layers of submarine landslides and deep-sea sediment flows known as turbidites. At first glance, the stories seem to match. Both tell of violent quakes, sudden shifts, and long silences in between. But when you try to align them page by page, layer by layer, things don't always line up. Which brings us to one of the most enduring and frustrating puzzles in the science of Cascadia megathrust earthquakes. Do the offshore records match the onshore ones? Or are we seeing 2 different timelines, fragmented by geology, misaligned by interpretation? Let's start with the offshore side. Beneath the ocean, off the Cascadia margin, lie submarine canyons, long narrow gashes that descend from the continental shelf into the abyssal depths. These canyons act as sediment highways. When a large earthquake hits, it can destabilize underwater slopes, triggering turbidity currents, basically underwater landslides that carry massive amounts of mud, sand, and organic material down into the deep ocean, where they settle in flat-bottom basins as distinct turbidite layers. These layers are stratified, datable, and often widely distributed across multiple canyons. In some cases, a single event leaves an identical signature across hundreds of kilometers of seafloor. For geologists, that's gold evidence of a large, regional seismic event. In Cascadia, researchers have found turbidite sequences that stretch back 10,000 years or more, showing at least 19 major earthquakes during that time. Sounds definitive, until you look back at the land. Onshore, evidence comes from coastal marshes, estuaries, and tidal inlets, where abrupt changes in elevation caused by subsidence during quakes leave buried soil horizons and layers of tsunami sand. Radiocarbon dating of plant remains, tree rings, and trapped marine shells provides a rough timeline of seismic activity. These layers offer localized, high-resolution snapshots of past events. But when researchers tried to match the offshore turbidites with onshore records, the results were inconsistent. Some major turbidites correspond neatly with coastal subsidence events. Others don't. Some tsunami deposits appear on land with no clear offshore turbidite partner. And then there are the problematic gaps intervals where offshore layers suggest a quake that somehow left no visible trace onshore. This raises several possibilities, none of them comforting. One explanation is rupture segmentation. Not all Cascadia earthquakes span the entire subduction zone. Some may rupture only the northern or southern segments, meaning the shaking isn't strong enough to cause widespread subsidence or tsunami deposition along the entire coast. These partial ruptures would register offshore, but leave limited onshore evidence. Another possibility is erosion and preservation bias. Sand sheets and marsh stratigraphy are vulnerable to storms, bioturbation, and human development. Some earthquake signatures may have simply been erased or never preserved in the first place. Offshore, sediments are more likely to accumulate in protected basins, giving a clearer long-term signal. There's also the issue of dating precision. Radiocarbon dating, while invaluable, comes with error bars. The deeper you dig, the wider the uncertainty. Matching land and sea records from thousands of years ago often means comparing events dated to within a few centuries, plenty of room for doubt. But perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that we're missing entire categories of events. Quakes that didn't cause massive shaking, or tsunamis that didn't leave sand, or ruptures that happened offshore without reaching the surface in ways we can detect. In that case, both records would be incomplete. Two partial stories, two biased narrators, each insisting on their version of events. Yet they both agree on one thing. Cascadia is not stable. It breaks, often, and sometimes all at once. That fractured agreement forces us to keep looking to pull more cores from the seafloor, to dig deeper into marshes, to refine the chronologies until they start speaking the same language. Because when they do, the picture they form won't just be academic. It'll be a map of future risk. And if that risk includes sudden land loss, inundation, and environmental collapse, we have to ask another question. How did the people who lived here long before us survive these upheavals? Which brings us back inland toward ancient lakes, early boats, and prehistoric island hopping across a landscape now dry, but once full of water and secrets. Pluvial Lake Chewaucan navigation. The Fort Rock Basin is a dry place now, dusty, cracked, flat. You can drive across it without realizing you're crossing a vanished lake, but the basin wasn't always silent. During the last ice age, this high desert bowl in south-central Oregon held one of the largest bodies of water in the region, Pluvial Lake Chewaucan. At its fullest, Chewaucan stretched over 375 square miles, reaching depths of nearly 200 feet. It sprawled across what are now the Summer Lake and Abbott Lake basins, covering miles of now exposed desert. And in its day, it wasn't just scenic, it was a transportation corridor. Which raises a very specific mystery. Did early people in Oregon navigate Lake Chewaucan by boat? And if so, how extensively and for what purpose? It's not a fringe idea. Across the world, humans have used boats far earlier than previously assumed. The first people to reach Australia, after all, did so by sea over 50,000 years ago. In the Americas, while coastal migration theories focus on Pacific seafaring, the potential for inland navigation has been largely overlooked. But in the Fort Rock Basin, it may have been essential. Picture the landscape not as it is now, but as it was 13,000 years ago. A sprawling lake dotted with islands, peninsulas, and wetlands, teeming with birds, fish, and aquatic plants. The shorelines shifted with the seasons. River inlets braided and re-braided. Travel by land would have meant detours, obstacles, and long slogs through marshy terrain. Now imagine you had a lightweight, Thule reed raft, something portable, something traditional. The indigenous people of the Great Basin are known to have used such watercraft in more recent times. Could their ancient ancestors have done the same? Archaeological sites like Paisley Caves and Fort Rock Cave lie just above the ancient lake levels, perfectly situated for lakeside occupation. Evidence of sustained use stone tools, coprolites, food remains suggests long-term habitation. But here's where the silence begins. No direct evidence of prehistoric boats has been found. That's not surprising. Reed rafts don't fossilize. Organic material decays. If you're expecting a preserved canoe, you'll be disappointed. What we're left with is circumstantial evidence. Campsites on what would have been islands, obsidian flakes in odd, isolated locations, rock art in places more easily reached by water than land. And then there's the practicality. With such an extensive lake, boat travel just makes sense, especially for resource gathering, seasonal movement, or social interaction across scattered groups. Water is faster, safer, smoother. So, if boats were used, what did they look like? Reed rafts, dugout canoes, skin-covered frames? All are possible, but none leave definitive traces. We're chasing ghosts on water. And then comes the cultural question. Were these journeys just practical, or were they ceremonial, symbolic, even sacred? In many indigenous cultures, water is not just a barrier. It's a liminal space, a zone between worlds. Lake Chihuahuan may have been a place of gathering, trade, or pilgrimage. It's worth noting that many rock art panels are found near ancient shorelines, at places where land meets former water. Were these markers, navigation points, warnings? No one knows. But as the lake eventually dried, retreating into puddles and salt flats, it left behind shorelines, wave-cut terraces, and scattered artifacts. The land still remembers the water, even if the people who once sailed it left nothing but whispers. And perhaps that's the real mystery. What happens when your highways vanish? When your culture was built around a lake that no longer exists? If Lake Chihuahuan was once a living map, what stories are still buried beneath its dust? And are they waiting, not to be found, but to be refloated just long enough to be understood? Picture Rock Pass panels. At the narrow corridor where Summer Lake and Silver Lake basins nearly kiss, Picture Rock Pass cuts a shallow path through the Fort Rock uplands, a low saddle, barely noticeable in elevation, but packed with ancient weight. If you stop just off the highway and walk a few dozen yards toward a basalt outcrop, you'll find them, petroglyphs, silent and scorched by time. They don't yell for your attention. They wait for it. The Picture Rock Pass petroglyph panels are a collection of carvings etched into the basalt by hands no one remembers, from a culture no one can fully trace. There are horned anthropomorphs, much like those at the nearby Picture Rock Pass site referenced earlier, along with a chaotic mix of linear designs, dots, spirals, and other geometrics that don't resolve into anything comfortably familiar. Some look vaguely like maps, others seem ritualistic, a few just look like noise until they don't. And then there's the question that continues to dog researchers and passers-by alike. Were these panels carved in a single cultural moment, or are they palimpsests? In other words, are we looking at one message or 1,000 overlaid fragments created by different people across different centuries, all speaking in variations of the same lost language? It's not just a stylistic puzzle, it's a chronological one. Petroglyph dating is notoriously difficult. You can't radiocarbon date rock scratches. What you can do is analyze desert varnish, the darkened skin of manganese oxide that slowly forms on exposed rock surfaces in arid climates. Deeper varnish suggests older carvings, but environmental conditions, rock type, and even air pollution can interfere with rates of varnish accumulation. Some petroglyphs at Picture Rock Pass have developed deep patination, suggesting they may be 7,500 to over 10,000 years old. Others are fresh by comparison, their edges still sharp, their contrast stark against the rock. The implication is clear. This site wasn't used once, it was reused, perhaps again and again over thousands of years. And that brings us to the unsettling part. We don't know what any of them mean. Not definitively, not even approximately. Some researchers suggest territorial markers, signs of presence or control. Others propose cosmological maps, ceremonial calendars, or shamanic vision records. A few lean toward the symbolic: birth, death, seasons, animals, hunting, success. But in the absence of a living tradition to link them to, we are left with a collection of extremely old, deeply intentional carvings that do not explain themselves. The repetition of certain figures, especially horned humans, suggests a cultural through line, a persistent belief system or shared myth. But repetition doesn't mean sameness. Some figures are upright, others splayed, others distorted. Were these different roles, different outcomes, different phases of some unknown story? If the site was reused by different groups, different generations, it's also possible that meanings shifted over time, that one group's sacred symbol became another's cautionary tale, that a spiral once meant safety, and later, danger. In a site like this, ambiguity becomes its own form of preservation. And what of the location? Picture Rock Pass isn't an obvious ceremonial site. It's a corridor, a transition zone, a choke point between two basins, a place where travelers might rest, or wait, or turn back. In that sense, it's liminal space, not quite here, not quite there. And if rock art often appears in liminal spaces, it's not just because they're scenic. It's because they mark thresholds, places of crossing, boundaries between the ordinary and the mythic. The panels may have been waypoints, warnings, welcomes, or witnesses. We'll never know. But what we can say is that they aren't accidental. They aren't graffiti. They are an attempt to inscribe permanence in a landscape defined by change. And if you stand before them long enough, you begin to feel the weight of their silence. Not an absence of meaning, but the refusal to translate. And maybe that's the point. Maybe they weren't meant for us. But if this was a crossroads, cultural, spiritual, geographic, then we have to ask, what else passed through here? What ideas? What migrations? What shared visions? And in a nearby region, carved into another basin wall, are more figures stranger, more dispersed, and even harder to interpret. They don't form panels. They form patterns scattered like stars, or clans, or questions. Warner Valley, divided by Hart Mountain rock art. If the petroglyphs at Picture Rock Pass are framed like a message, the rock art of the Warner Valley and Hart Mountain region is more like a constellation. Spread across boulders, cliff faces, and basalt shelves, the imagery here isn't concentrated, it's dispersed, fragmented, almost accidental, except it's not. Tucked in Oregon's remote southeastern corner, this basin and range region is rugged, dry, and difficult to access. But for thousands of years, it was inhabited, and perhaps more intriguingly, mapped not with roads, but with symbols, hundreds of them. You don't find them all at once. You find them one by one, a spiral on a lone outcrop, a deer figure beside a seasonal spring, a series of dots marching across a vertical slab. Unlike the grand panels of Petroglyph Lake, the rock art in Warner Valley feels like a network interconnected, but not centralized, spread out, as if each location was part of a larger system of meaning we can no longer see. And here's where the mystery deepens. Do these motif distributions encode migration routes, social boundaries, or something else entirely, like astronomical knowledge or cosmology? Some researchers believe the positioning of rock art around the Warner Valley isn't random, that certain motifs, spirals, anthropomorphs, geometric patterns cluster in specific zones, possibly tied to clan territories, hunting regions, or sacred landscapes. Others see celestial analogs, arrangements that resemble star maps, lunar cycles, or solar alignments. In this theory, the entire basin becomes a kind of prehistoric observatory, with symbols placed not just in space, but in relation to each other. That's a bold claim, and difficult to prove. But it explains the compelling feeling that these carvings weren't just personal, they were positional. Still, dating remains elusive. The desert varnish is deep on some glyphs, suggesting ages in the thousands of years. Others seem more recent, possibly created just before or after contact with Europeans. With no firm chronology, we're left trying to reconstruct a cultural topography with no timestamps. And yet, the effort matters. Because If the rock art of Warner Valley does encode movement of people, of game, of stories, then these sites could be nodes in an invisible map, one that marks not just where people went, but why. Were these places of gathering, memory, ceremony? Were they boundary markers, asserting territory in an unforgiving landscape? Were they signposts for future generations, reminders of where to find water, or safety, or danger? And here's the final twist. Many of these panels are now isolated, not by time but by access. Modern fencing, private land, erosion, and vandalism have separated the pieces of a once coherent record. We're seeing fragments of something that may have once been whole. What stories have been lost in those gaps? Because if Warner Valley is a scattered archive of ancient meaning, then its silence is not accidental. It's an echo of a conversation interrupted by climate, by colonization, by forgetting. But one thing is clear. The rock art here wasn't random. It followed paths, patterns, boundaries, and just like in Picture Rock Pass, those boundaries might have marked more than geography. They may have encoded identity group affiliations, belief systems, mythic geographies, and in the very next mystery, that question sharpens. Can we use these motifs not just to trace ideas, but to map cultural boundaries across the ancient northern Great Basin? Can symbols act like fences? Or are they just footprints washed clean by time, but never fully erased? Cultural boundaries, Greaser and Picture Rock, pass motif sets, track social territories across the northern Great Basin. In the modern world, boundaries are lines on a map clearly defined, often arbitrary, usually disputed. But long before fences, treaties, and GPS coordinates, people marked space differently. Through memory, through story, and sometimes through symbols etched into stone. This is the question that looms quietly behind the petroglyphs of the northern Great Basin. Were motif sets like those at Greaser and Picture Rock Pass more than just expressions of belief or vision? Were they territorial? In other words, did these ancient figures mark not just who people were, but where they were from? It's not a far-fetched idea. Across the world, from Australia's Dreamtime engravings to the clan markings of the American Southwest, indigenous groups have used rock art as a way to communicate presence, ancestry, warnings, and welcome. Symbols can signal belonging, or borders. At Greaser Petroglyph site, we see dense panels of abstract forms, circles, spirals, gridded patterns, and occasional horned figures, many of which are deeply weathered, suggesting extreme age. These motifs cluster heavily around certain outcrops, but rarely stray beyond specific zones. Meanwhile, at Picture Rock Pass, just under 100 miles northwest, the rock art is distinctively different. More anthropomorphic figures, more narrative-like scenes, more vertical compositions. To the untrained eye, these differences may seem stylistic, just different artists, different times. But when mapped carefully, patterns begin to emerge. Certain motifs appear only at Greaser. Others appear only at Picture Rock Pass. A few appear at both, but rarely in the same style. That suggests not just individual preference, but regional tradition. Now, what does regional tradition usually imply? Group identity. And where there is identity, there are often boundaries. Some archaeologists now believe that these motif sets may have functioned like social signatures, visual indicators of group presence, tradition, or even ownership. That doesn't mean the way we understand property today. It's more fluid, more permeable, but still significant. Rock art may have served as a way of saying, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is our place. It's not hard to imagine a traveler crossing into another group's territory, seeing unfamiliar glyphs and immediately knowing they were elsewhere. The carvings wouldn't need to be interpreted in exact detail. Recognition would be enough. This theory gains traction when compared with mobile societies in other parts of the world. In regions where people moved seasonally between winter and summer camps, Between hunting grounds and gathering zones, visual territorial cues became essential. You couldn't build fences, but you could build meaning into landscape features. And rocks don't move. Of course, none of this is universally accepted. Skeptics point out that many rock art sites show overlapping styles, reused surfaces, and superimposed figures. That suggests shared spaces, not fixed boundaries. They argue that spiritual meaning or cosmology better explains the iconographic differences. That perhaps Greaser and Picture Rock Pass simply hosted different ceremonies, different visions, or different phases in symbolic evolution. Fair enough. But even in that reading, the symbols still track difference. If not political boundaries, then at least cultural zones, separate languages, beliefs, identities. And when you look at the broader region stretching into Nevada, Idaho, and Northern California, those zones appear to follow ecological corridors, migration routes, and resource patches. In short, the people who made these carvings weren't wandering aimlessly. They were moving through a mapped world, one where stories, songs, and symbols marked the edges of memory. And that brings us to the real question. Did those boundaries hold through time? Were they passed down across centuries, through fire, famine, flood, and volcanic ash? Because in the Fort Rock Connley region, something strange happened after Mount Mazama erupted roughly 7,700 years ago. A blast that covered the region in ash, that changed the light. That changed the water. That may have erased or reinforced those old boundaries. Which brings us to the next mystery. Did Western-stemmed groups vanish after the eruption? Or did they quietly adapt, staying put even as the land turned to dust? WST persistence through Mazama. Did Western-stemmed groups in the Fort Rock Connley area relocate or adapt locally after the eruption? It's one of the most disruptive moments in the late prehistoric Northwest. Around 7,700 years ago, Mount Mazama, a massive stratovolcano in the southern Oregon Cascades, blew itself apart in a catastrophic eruption that left behind Crater Lake and scattered volcanic ash across thousands of square miles. For the Fort Rock Connley area, the effect was immediate and overwhelming. Ash rained down in thick sheets, up to 50 centimeters deep in some locations. Rivers choked. Vegetation died. Lakes turned turbid. The breathable world became abrasive. And yet, when we look at the archaeological record, we find something that doesn't quite fit the disaster narrative. People didn't leave. Or if they did, they came back fast. The region's human occupation doesn't show a clear break after the Mazama eruption. Instead, it shows continuity, Western-stemmed tradition, WST artifacts before the ash, and more after. Maybe fewer for a time, maybe slightly different, but still there. Which raises the mystery. Did WST groups actually persist through the eruption locally, in situ, or did a new wave of migrants move back into the ash-covered landscape? Let's back up. The WST, with its signature stemmed projectile points and flake tools, is one of the most prominent archaeological traditions in the Great Basin. Found in deep stratigraphy at Paisley Caves, Connley Caves, and other high desert sites, it represents a complex, mobile forager lifeway that predates and possibly overlaps with Clovis. But the eruption of Mazama should have been a hard stop. It blanketed the landscape with sterile, nutrient-poor ash. It disrupted ecosystems. For years, maybe decades, it would have been difficult to hunt, gather, or even see the land as familiar. So how did people survive? Some suggest rapid adaptation. WST groups may have shifted their foraging patterns, focused on upland resources less affected by ash, or exploited edge zones areas with thinner ash fall. They may have switched to smaller game, changed processing techniques, retooled. Others propose seasonal migration. Groups could have temporarily abandoned the worst-hit zones, retreating to more stable areas north or east, then returning as conditions improved. In that view, persistence isn't about staying, it's about maintaining connection. But the artifact record muddies the water. Post-Mazama layers in the Fort Rock Connley area continue to show stemmed projectile points very similar to their pre-eruption counterparts. That continuity suggests cultural persistence, not replacement. These aren't strangers moving in. They're descendants, adapting. And here's what complicates things even further. Some archaeological features like house pit floors, hearths, and middens show no break across the Mazama tephra layer. Occupation was disrupted, but not abandoned. People didn't just survive the ash, they lived in it. That suggests a kind of resilience we rarely credit prehistoric groups with. The eruption was massive, but not civilization ending. It changed the land, it changed behavior, but it didn't erase the people. Of course, there's still debate. Some argue that changes in toolkits post-eruption reflect cultural turnover, that the people who came after weren't the same as those before. That WST points might have persisted in form, but not in identity. But even that view admits something vital. The form endured. The memory of how to make and use these tools survived the blast. And maybe that's the lesson. That tradition isn't just what you preserve during peace, it's what you carry through catastrophe. Because the Fort Rock Basin didn't stay the same. After Mazama, it became even more volatile, subject to wild hydrological swings, rapid lake level changes, and a climate trying to decide which direction to go. And yet, people kept adapting. Or they didn't. And the only way we can know is by tracing the water, watching the lakes rise and vanish. Because the next mystery is not about ash. It's about flood and drought, playing tug of war with survival. Pleistocene-Holocene swings. What drove rapid water level, changes in the Fort Rock Christmas Lake Valley, and how did people adapt? The Fort Rock Christmas Lake Valley looks bone dry today, wind-swept, saline, and mostly silent. A place where sagebrush dominates and water feels like a rumor. But peel back the layers of time, and the desert turns aquatic. Beneath the dust lies a buried shoreline, and another, a stair-step record of water rising and falling, not over millennia, but sometimes within decades. The question is, why did the lake levels here change so drastically during the Pleistocene-Holocene transition? And equally important, how did early human populations ride out that chaos? This isn't just about climate, it's about unpredictability. Roughly 13,000 to 8,000 years ago, as the Ice Age wound down and the Holocene climate regime crept in, the Fort Rock Christmas Lake Valley transformed repeatedly. Where one year there may have been a shallow marsh, the next could bring a freshwater lake dozens of feet deep, and 5 years later, salt flats, then back again. Geologists have documented at least 5 major lake transgressions and regressions in this span, each leaving behind shorelines, tufa deposits, and sediment sequences. These weren't slow shifts. Some occurred over mere centuries, or even decades, suggesting highly unstable climate forcing. So, what caused the volatility? A mix of suspects lines up. Glacial meltwater pulses altering downstream hydrology. Shifting jet streams due to the retreat of continental ice sheets. Localized rainfall anomalies tied to changing Pacific Ocean conditions. Volcanic activity, like Mazama, that temporarily disrupted atmospheric systems. And possibly, even sudden groundwater shifts due to faulting or crustal flexing. No single driver explains all the swings. What we're left with is a hydrologic roller coaster, one that early people had to ride without warning or guarantees. And somehow, they did. Archaeological evidence from sites like Connley Caves, Fort Rock Cave, and the periphery of now dry basins shows repeated human presence that seems to track the rhythms of the water. When lakes were full, people settled near the shores, fishing, foraging, and hunting waterfowl. When the water vanished, they moved to uplands or shifted subsistence strategies. This isn't just movement, it's resilience strategy. Toolkits evolved, obsidian sources shifted, hearths appear at higher elevations during dry spells and cluster near paleo shorelines when water was abundant. These weren't passive observers of climate, they were active adapters, mobile, flexible, and attuned to environmental cues. One key adaptation may have been resource storage. In some layers, archaeologists have found concentrated caches of seeds, bone, and tools, hinting at stockpiling behaviors, a way to hedge against resource collapses. This suggests planning, social coordination, maybe even ritual behaviors surrounding scarcity. Another adaptation was likely social networking. When one basin dried up, groups probably moved to another. Trade routes between obsidian sources, like those near Glass Buttes, seem to have remained active even during climate stress, implying intergroup cooperation or migration corridors. But not every shift was handled smoothly. There's growing evidence that some lake regressions led to abandonment periods, gaps in occupation, that suggest even highly adaptable foragers couldn't always ride out the instability. That's where the archaeological record stutters, where fire pits vanish, where stone tools stop appearing. Did people move away? Die off? Merge with other groups? We don't know. But what's clear is that hydrologic volatility wasn't a one-time shock. It was a recurring stress test, an environmental riddle that had to be solved over and over again across generations. And it wasn't the last. Because after the Holocene settled in, it didn't bring stability. It brought its own crises. Not cataclysmic eruptions, not mile-high floods. Something subtler. Long drought. Shrinking wetlands. Dry years stacked into dry centuries. And then the question wasn't just, where is the water now? It became, is it ever coming back? Mid-Holocene aridity was human use of Fort Rock Basin wetlands, continuous or punctuated by abandonment phases. We tend to think of desertification as a process, gradual, predictable, but in the Fort Rock Basin, it wasn't a fade, it was a cut, a hard turn. Somewhere around 8,000 years ago, the water pulled back and didn't return, at least not consistently. What had been a dance between wet and dry became a monologue of aridity. And the big question is, did people stay? Or was this one of the times when even the most resilient lifeways hit their limit? This is the Mid-Holocene mystery. A long, dry chapter in Oregon's deep past where environmental evidence suggests widespread desiccation, yet the human story grows quiet. The lakes didn't just shrink, they vanished. Marshes retreated. Springs dried up. The Fort Rock wetlands became dust bowls, the kind where only bitterbrush, rabbits, and the occasional ghost sandal remain. In sediment cores and pollen records, we see clear markers of this arid phase. A drop in aquatic plants, a spike in sagebrush and arid adapted grasses, reduced charcoal, suggesting fewer fires and maybe fewer people to start them. All the biological signs point to drought on a civilizational scale. So what does the archaeology say? It says almost nothing. This is the curious gap. The Middle Holocene, archaeological silence. Between roughly 8,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Fort Rock Basin yields far fewer sites, artifacts, or indicators of sustained human occupation. Earlier layers are rich with WST tools and organic remains. Later layers show resurgence with different technologies. But in the middle, a lull, which has led some researchers to propose abandonment, a temporary exodus. People left the basin perhaps for the forested uplands, the Klamath marshes, or wetter Great Basin interiors, places where water still moved and life could be sustained. But others push back. They argue that the apparent silence may be a data illusion, a result of preservation bias, low visibility sites, or simply the limitations of our current survey efforts. They ask, what if people did stay, but in smaller numbers, in ephemeral camps, leaving traces too thin for us to see? It's a valid point. Mobile foragers don't build cities. They leave behind flakes, hearth stains, maybe a broken tool or two. In an arid wind-blown basin, those signs don't always survive. And if they do, we might not be looking in the right places. But even if people stayed, the nature of their presence likely changed. With wetlands gone or severely reduced, they would have had to decentralize. No more clustered camps at lake edges. Instead, scattered foraging paths, seasonal expeditions, a loosening of the land's once tight grip. And when the climate finally shifted again, when rain returned, even modestly the basin reopened. Around 5,000 years ago, we see a slow resurgence. New tool types, hearths, animal bones, and eventually, the bow and arrow. This wasn't a simple return. It was a transformation. The people who came back, or persisted, were not WST by tradition. They were the descendants of adaptability, shaped by centuries of dryness. In that sense, the Mid-Holocene aridity was not just an ecological event. It was a cultural bottleneck, a crucible. It tested the edges of survival and memory. It may have erased names, but it didn't erase the land's importance. Today, when we walk the dry playa flats of the Fort Rock Basin, it's easy to see desolation. But every shoreline curve, every tufa mound, every ghost spring tells a different story. One of return, of memory, of people watching the skies, wondering if the rains would ever come back and what they'd bring with them when they did. Because when the water did return, it wasn't just old lakes that reappeared. It was a second chance. And it left behind new debris, strange rocks, misplaced giants. And now we ask, can we track those stones all the way home? Or do even boulders forget where they came from? Erratic provenance. Can we pin specific Willamette Valley erratics to northern Rockies source units with geochemical certainty? At first glance, they don't seem like mysteries at all. Just boulders, stranded, lichen-flecked, looming out of plowed fields or perched on hillsides where no mountain ever stood. Some are granite, some are quartzite, some are metamorphic monsters you'd expect to find in the core of a mountain range, not the middle of Oregon farmland. These are the glacial erratics of the Willamette Valley, and they're not just misplaced, they're impossible, if you believe in geology behaving itself. Because the Willamette Valley is mostly made of sedimentary silt, volcanic debris, and uplifted marine rock, these erratics, they belong to the northern Rockies, hundreds of miles away, across several mountain chains and at least one modern political border. The fact that they're here at all is a geological betrayal and a forensic puzzle. So we ask, can we trace each of these boulders back to their geological source? Can we determine exactly where they came from using geochemical signatures, mineralogy, and isotopic fingerprints? Short answer, we're trying. Long answer, not quite yet. Let's back up. During the Ice Age, when glacial Lake Missoula repeatedly breached its ice dam, it sent catastrophic megafloods surging across eastern Washington, through the Columbia River Gorge, and into the Willamette Valley. These floods were fast, deep, and ice-laden massive torrents carrying not just water, but icebergs the size of city blocks. Trapped within those icebergs were rocks, chunks of mountain torn loose by glaciers, embedded in the frozen matrix. As the icebergs drifted south and slowly melted, the rocks dropped out. Wherever the iceberg paused, the rock was deposited. That's how a 15-ton chunk of belt supergroup quartzite ends up on a grassy knoll outside Salem. Or a massive granite block from the Idaho batholith ends up on a hillside near McMinnville. Icebergs don't care about your topographic expectations. They drift, they melt, they leave weird souvenirs. The problem is, many of these boulders look generic. Quartzite is quartzite. Granite is granite. Without detailed analysis, they could have come from dozens of places across the northern Rockies. So how do we pinpoint their origins? Enter petrographic analysis, X-ray fluorescence, XRF, and isotopic tracing tools that allow geologists to break down a rock's mineral composition, elemental ratios, and even its age. These techniques have helped match some erratics to known formations, like the Belt Supergroup in western Montana or the Purcell Trench region near the Idaho-Canada border. But the process is slow, and results can be ambiguous. Weathering, alteration, and transportation can obscure original signals. And the flood system wasn't a single pipeline, it was a chaotic, braided mess. Icebergs may have floated along erratic paths, paused in eddies, spun in whirlpools. Two erratics sitting 50 feet apart today could have come from opposite ends of the continent. To make things harder, many erratics lie in private fields, inaccessible sites, or undocumented locations. Only a fraction have been sampled. Many more remain unexamined, unprovenanced, and uncelebrated. And yet, the clues are mounting. Researchers have begun cataloging erratics across the valley, building spatial models that correlate elevation, lithology, and ice raft behavior. One particularly telling trend: many erratics cluster around certain backflood basins, suggesting iceberg stalling zones. Some are found high up on valley margins, marking flood crest limits. Others cluster near ancient eddy deposits, where currents would have slowed and released their icy cargo. As more of these rocks are chemically fingerprinted, a pattern may emerge, one that maps not just rock movement, but iceberg drift patterns, flood velocities, and even chronology. In that sense, erratics aren't just leftovers. They're data points, frozen in stone. But we're not there yet. The erratic puzzle remains partly unsolved. For every rock confidently matched to a source formation, a dozen remain anonymous. Mute migrants. And that's part of the unsettling charm. These rocks are orphans, evidence of a climate engine so massive it could rearrange the crust and then forget where it put the pieces. But they're also guideposts, because the places they landed tell us where the water once went and how high it climbed. Which brings us to a particularly curious case. One erratic, stranded at a height too high for comfort. So high, in fact, it's become its own state park. Understood. Returning to the correct order. Let's continue with the next segment as listed. Portland Basin flood paths. How many backwater pulses and which routes did they follow through the basin and tributaries? To understand the mystery of the Portland Basin's flood paths, you first have to unsee the modern city. Erase the bridges, flatten the skyline, strip away the roads, the coffee shops, the warehouses. Remove the Columbia River dams, let the Willamette go wild, and sink the suburbs under hundreds of feet of cold, sediment-laden water. Now, imagine this happens not once, but dozens of times. With varying speeds, depths, and entry points. This isn't dystopia. It's the Pleistocene reality of the Portland Basin, an ancient, bowl-shaped depression that, for thousands of years, functioned less like a river valley and more like a temporary inland sea. And it wasn't calm. It pulsed, over and over. The question geologists have been chasing for decades is deceptively simple. How many of the Missoula flood pulses reached the Portland Basin, and through which precise routes and tributaries did they travel? The problem is, this basin wasn't just a flood recipient, it was a flood distributor. The water didn't just pour in, it filled up, spilled out, backed up, and flowed sideways. In essence, it behaved like an overflowing bathtub with way too many drains, some obvious, others hidden under 15,000 years of sediment. Let's start with the basics. The Columbia River Gorge served as the main flood highway, funneling catastrophic glacial outburst floods from eastern Washington toward the Pacific. When the floods reached the narrow, steep-walled gorge, they were still moving fast, estimated at speeds of up to 60 miles per hour. But once they hit the Portland Basin, the terrain flattened, the current slowed, and the water began to pond. It didn't just rise, it spread. The floodwaters overflowed the Columbia's banks and pushed into every available side channel. The Willamette River corridor, reaching as far south as Eugene. The Tualatin River Basin, creating a temporary lake where Beaverton and Hillsborough now sit. The Clackamas River Valley, likely experiencing surges that overtopped valley walls. Possibly even Salmon Creek and Johnson Creek, both overwhelmed by lateral backflow. But here's the tricky part. Not every Missoula flood made it that far. Some pulses were blocked by ice jams further upstream. Others dissipated before reaching Portland. So the first task is to count the pulses, which, as it turns out, is harder than it sounds. In flood-deposited sediments across the Portland Basin, particularly in backwater areas like Lake Oswego, Gresham, and West Lynn, geologists have found multiple distinct slackwater deposits. These are fine-grained silts and clays, laid down as the floodwaters stagnated and slowed. Each layer is like a page in the flood story, and current estimates suggest at least 7 to 10 distinct flood layers are preserved in the basin. But the true number could be much higher. Over 40 Missoula flood events are documented elsewhere in the Columbia drainage. So why don't we see all of them in Portland? Because the Portland Basin, unlike the channeled scablands, is a low-energy environment. If a flood pulse wasn't large enough to breach certain thresholds, height, duration, sediment load, it may have left little to no trace. Some floods may have been invisible, geologically speaking, which is where modeling comes in. Hydrologists have run computer simulations of floodwater movement through the gorge and into the basin, adjusting for depth, velocity, and terrain. These models show a pattern of backflooding into the Portland Basin during each major pulse, first inundating the eastern lowlands, then pushing west into the Tualatin and Willamette systems. In some scenarios, Lake Allison, the name given to the Willamette Valley's temporary flood lake, fills not from the south, but from the north backward. That inversion is crucial. It tells us the basin didn't just receive water, it redirected it. Depending on the size and duration of each pulse, the Portland Basin acted as a hydraulic switchboard, altering the direction and velocity of water in multiple tributaries. One flood might push water down the Tualatin, another might bypass it entirely. A third might rebound up the Willamette with enough force to strand icebergs and present-day vineyards. The sedimentary record supports this chaos. In cores taken near Oregon City, for example, researchers found flood deposits that appear reversed fine silt atop coarse gravel, suggesting not inflow but rebound. Elsewhere, deposits of erratic boulders are found far inland, where only backflow could have carried them. Even more bizarrely, some upland terraces show signs of stillwater deposits, meaning the floodwaters may have pooled in place for weeks or months before fully draining. What emerges from all this isn't a single flood path, but a complex, dynamic choreography of flood waves, each with its own character. Some arrived violently, others crept in quietly, seeped into low-lying basins, and left behind nothing but silt and confusion. So, how many pulses entered the Portland Basin? We don't know. How many routes did they take? At least half a dozen, probably more. How long did the floods last? Hours to weeks, depending on the topography. In other words, we're still mapping ghosts. Water ghosts. And they're not done speaking. Because just downstream of Portland, in the rolling foothills of Yamhill County, sits a geological paradox. An island of volcanic ash surrounded by lake sediment, formed by fire and water fighting in real time. So, the next question isn't just how the flood moved. It's what exploded when it hit a volcano submerged beneath it. Hidden and eroded rock art. How many unrecorded panels, for example, near Picture Gorge, remain buried, overgrown, or vandalized, altering our understanding? The landscape doesn't always tell you what it's hiding. In eastern Oregon, where basalt cliffs fracture like broken puzzles and canyons hide in plain sight, the record of ancient art isn't just visible, it's incomplete. At Picture Gorge, a tight and dramatic cleft carved by the John Day River, petroglyphs cling to walls like ghosts, fading in and out of stone. But for every panel we know, there's a growing suspicion that many more have been lost, buried, eroded, or defaced, and with them, vital clues to Oregon's deep human past. So, here's the mystery. How many rock art panels remain hidden in the Oregon landscape, especially around Picture Gorge, and how does their loss or concealment skew our entire perception of pre-contact cultural expression? It's not just a question of numbers. It's about narrative distortion. The known panels at Picture Gorge and surrounding areas are compelling complex anthropomorphs, abstract symbols, animal tracks, perhaps even star-like arrays. Some appear high on inaccessible rock faces. Others were carved near riverbanks, where travelers would have paused, camped, or watched the water move. But field surveys conducted over the past several decades have shown something troubling. The visible petroglyph record is shrinking, and it's probably always been just a fraction of what once existed. There are a few reasons for this, none of them pretty. First, there's natural erosion. Basalt, while durable, fractures along joint lines and weathers under the relentless cycle of freeze and thaw. Petroglyphs exposed to centuries of rain, wind, and lichen slowly lose their edge, sometimes vanishing entirely. A symbol carved 10,000 years ago may now be nothing more than a rough patch in the rock face, too degraded to detect, even with digital enhancement. Second, and more insidious, is vegetation overgrowth. As fire regimes have shifted and invasive species have taken hold, many once bare panels are now covered in moss, grasses, or shrubs. Even trees. This isn't just bad visibility, it's ecological camouflage. Hike through a canyon at the wrong time of year and you'll walk right past centuries-old carvings, hidden under cheatgrass or tangled in willow. But perhaps the most frustrating cause of loss is human interference. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, ranchers, settlers, and even bored road crews have carved over or destroyed ancient panels. Some dynamited cliffs for building stone. Others repurposed petroglyph-covered boulders for fencing. A few, in misguided enthusiasm, chiseled panels loose to take home, scattering Oregon's sacred landscapes into museum drawers or private collections across the country. And then there's modern vandalism. Names scratched into ancient rock, bullet holes, spray paint. In some cases, it's impossible to tell where the original art ends and the damage begins. The result? A fragmented archive. We're trying to read a cultural text with entire chapters ripped out, pages burned, sentences rewritten. This distorts everything. Imagine a map where only 20% of the landmarks are visible. Every conclusion you draw about movement, identity, or meaning becomes suspect. Are horned anthropomorphs truly rare? Or did we just lose most of them? Were certain motifs clustered deliberately, or were the other clusters wiped clean by erosion, roads, or ranching? Some researchers are now using LiDAR, photogrammetry, and hyperspectral imaging to hunt for faint or buried panels. Early results are promising glyphs once thought eroded are re-emerging under digital scrutiny. But we're still decades behind where we could be. Survey coverage is patchy. Many potential sites are on private land or too remote for current efforts, which leaves us with a tantalizing and uncomfortable conclusion. The petroglyph record in Oregon is not only incomplete, it's actively misleading. What we've preserved may be the exception, not the rule. And that reframes our entire interpretation of prehistoric art in the region. Instead of asking, what were these people trying to say, we must also ask, what were they saying that we'll never hear? Because the symbols lost to erosion, overgrowth, and vandalism aren't just decoration. They're cultural messages. They marked presence, territory, belief, memory. And if we've misread their distribution, we may have misunderstood entire migration routes, tribal boundaries, even time periods. So when we look at what remains, we're peering through a keyhole into a vast, shattered archive, one that still holds surprises if we're willing to search differently. Which brings us to another problem. Even when panels are found, they don't always agree. Dates don't line up. Stratigraphy doesn't behave. Layers contradict each other. And so we arrive at the next mystery. When early occupation sites give conflicting signals, how do we reconcile the evidence? Or maybe more truthfully, can we? Reconciling early dates. When stratigraphy is complex, for example, Fort Rock area, how do we harmonize conflicting early occupation estimates? This is where the ground starts gaslighting us. In the Fort Rock Basin, some of the earliest sites in North America whisper timelines that predate Clovis, suggest deep human antiquity, and offer tantalizing glimpses of Ice Age occupation. But try to build a coherent narrative out of the data, and you'll find yourself trapped in a hall of mirrors. Why? Because the dates don't match, the layers contradict, the signals point in different directions. So, the mystery becomes, when stratigraphy is this complex, how do we reconcile conflicting early occupation estimates? Let's take Fort Rock Cave as a case study. Originally excavated by Luther Cressman in the 1930 seconds, Fort Rock Cave yielded the now famous sagebrush sandals, radiocarbon dated to over 9,000 years ago, the oldest footwear in the world at the time. But beneath those layers were hearths, bone fragments, and tool debris that seemed even older. The problem was, the contexts were messy. Rodents, wind deflation, human disturbance, and slope wash had all jumbled the stratigraphy. When charcoal from a lower level produced an age of 13,200 years, skeptics raised eyebrows. Was that charcoal truly in situ, or had it been dragged there from an upper layer? Similar issues appear at Connley Caves, Cougar Mountain Cave, and other Fort Rock sites. One layer suggests a human presence around 12,000 years ago. Another, just inches away, points to 10,000, 500, or 8,000, or more. The variation isn't trivial. It changes our understanding of when people arrived, how they responded to climate shifts, and whether they were here before Clovis or part of a broader post-glacial migration. So, what's causing the inconsistency? Some of it's geological. The Fort Rock Basin is a deflation-prone landscape. Wind constantly moves sediment. Dust storms lift fine particles, exposing or covering sites unevenly. Over time, shallow sites become palimpsests, with old material surfacing and newer layers eroding away. Other distortions come from bioturbation. Burrowing animals, plant roots, and even insects can drag artifacts and charcoal up or down through layers, scrambling the order of events. And then there's the matter of human activity. Multiple occupations, sometimes centuries apart, leave overlapping debris fields. Without clear pit features, it's nearly impossible to isolate which tools go with which hearth. All of this makes radiocarbon dating a delicate game. A single piece of charcoal might be older than the activity that deposited it, or younger, or displaced by rodents 1,000 years after the fact. So, how do archaeologists deal with this? Some use Bayesian modeling, a statistical approach that blends radiocarbon dates with stratigraphic assumptions to produce probability windows. Others deploy micromorphology, analyzing soil structure at the microscopic level to detect subtle disturbances. But even with the best tools, uncertainty remains. For every model that says, yes, humans were here before Clovis, another says, maybe, or maybe it's contamination. And the implications are enormous. If even one Fort Rock site is securely pre-Clovis, it rewrites the peopling of the Americas. It pushes back timelines. It opens the door to coastal or ice-free corridor migrations earlier than once believed. It adds new voices to the ancient chorus. But if the dates can't be trusted, if stratigraphy is too jumbled, then we're chasing ghosts in sediment, which leaves us with a final, brutal possibility. We may never fully harmonize these early occupation estimates, and maybe we shouldn't try to force them into coherence. Because sometimes, complexity isn't a flaw in the record. It is the record. The land didn't preserve a neat sequence. It preserved a tangle of arrivals, departures, returns, adaptations, a nonlinear past written in nonlinear layers. And if that's true, then maybe the question isn't who got here first. It's who stayed through the chaos. And what did they leave behind when the rest of us forgot? Which brings us to the final riddle, the very first signal, and the implications it might still carry. If Rimrock Draw's is greater than 18,000-year signal holds, what does that imply about the earliest routes and tempo of human entry into Oregon? Let's imagine it holds. Let's say the camelid tooth from Rimrock Draw rock shelter dated to over 18,000 years ago, really does have embedded human-modified flakes under the enamel. Let's say it wasn't disturbed by burrowing, wasn't a lab error, wasn't a cruel coincidence of nature mimicking culture. Let's say the ash layer from Mount Street. Helen's G beneath the hearth is correctly identified and firmly dated. And let's say the hearth above it really is as old as the radiocarbon clock says it island. If that's true, if the signal holds, then the entire story of the peopling of the Americas shifts west, and it shifts earlier. We're not just talking about Oregon's deep past anymore. We're talking about a continent-wide reframe. Because 18,000 years ago puts Rimrock Draw at least 2,000 years earlier than Clovis, and well before the traditionally accepted ice-free corridor route was open for business. That corridor, the classic textbook explanation, was a pathway between retreating ice sheets, supposedly allowing humans to walk from Beringia into the North American interior. But that corridor wasn't viable until about 13,000 years ago, so if people were in Oregon 5,000 years before that, then they didn't use the front door. They took the side entrance. This is where the coastal migration hypothesis returns with a vengeance. If Rimrock Draw is valid, then early humans must have moved along the Pacific Rim hopping ice-free refugia, following kelp forests, skirting glacial margins. In this model, boats aren't a luxury, they're a requirement, and so is maritime knowledge. But even the coastal route isn't a straight line. The terrain would have been rugged, the climate unstable, sea levels 100 meters lower than today, shorelines now underwater, evidence submerged or eroded. If people came this way, they left few clues except, perhaps, in places like Connley Caves, Cooper's Ferry, and now Rimrock Draw. And if the Rimrock Hearth really dates to 18,000 plus years ago, then even coastal migration might not be early enough, because that would mean people were already inland, already navigating the Great Basin, already familiar with high desert ecologies. They weren't just passing through, they were established. That challenges another assumption, that human expansion into North America was rapid and directional. A swift wave model moving south from Alaska, sweeping across the continent. But Rimrock suggests something slower, messier, and more distributed. Maybe people arrived in pulses, not waves. Maybe they settled early, in isolated refugia. Maybe they got here earlier than we thought, and stayed put for centuries before anyone else noticed. It's a haunting image. A small band of humans, perhaps only a few families, carving out an existence in Ice Age Oregon while mammoths still roamed and glaciers towered to the north. No cities, no empires. Just presence, just the quiet persistence of human survival where no one expected it yet. And if they were here 18,000 years ago, then who were they? They wouldn't have been Clovis. That toolkit hadn't been invented. They might not even have left distinctive projectile points. Their tools may have been simple flakes, lost in a sea of stone fragments, hard to identify without context. Their dwellings, perishable. Their stories, unrecorded. Which means archaeology is doing something strange here, looking for ghosts without names. Using tooth enamel and microscopic stone scars to reconstruct intention, presence, and meaning. And it's not just Rimrock. Cooper's Ferry in western Idaho has human-associated dates approaching 16,000 years ago. The Connley Caves just miles from Rimrock have coprolites dated to at least 14,000 years. If even one of these signals holds, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. What we're seeing isn't a fluke, it's a foundation. And that foundation raises big questions. How long did it take people to move from Beringia to Oregon? Were they even coming from Beringia at all? Could there have been multiple migrations? Could south to north movement have occurred too? In other words, maybe the question isn't, when did people arrive in Oregon? Maybe it's, why did they choose to stay here? Because Oregon is more than a waypoint. It's a confluence of coast, interior, desert, and mountain. A survivalist's laboratory. A refuge when the rest of the continent was chaos. A place where culture could take root early quietly and independently. If Rimrock Draw holds, then this isn't just a scientific anomaly. It's a new origin story, not of humanity itself, but of our presence here. And it ends, not with a solution, but with a humbling recalibration. Because deep time doesn't care about our categories. It doesn't respect our timelines, our name traditions, or our heroic narratives of firsts. It leaves traces, teeth, ash, rock, and if we're lucky, a flicker of intention caught in the middle of nowhere. That's what Rimrock offers, a possibility that all our stories began before we had stories.